Hey guys, this is Star What If. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part what if Harry Potter had never succumbed to Voldemort's manipulation. Here is short summary. What if Harry rejected Voldemort's manipulation? Witness Harry's defiant path as he embraces his true survival instincts, fighting for freedom and the future of the wizarding world. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Harry was amazed by how different Voldemort's dueling style was from the man he'd faced before, almost as though they were completely different people. This man had grace and finesse, he had power and confidence to back it up. The moment the duel started, Harry's heart stopped. He knew he was going to lose, they both did, they were simply dancing, just as the man had said. Harry was free to give the duel his all, everything that he'd held back for so long pouring from him, spell after spell, turn after spin after leap after jump and duck. His shoulder took a blow, but he didn't notice, he was having fun. There was a charge between them, an electrical current that zapped and burned them when they touched, leaving the hair on the backs of their arms standing on end. Beautiful, the man murmured as Harry narrowly spun away from a cleverly hidden attack. Silent spells, oh you brute. Harry panted, his eyes ablaze with passion and fire. He felt alive. He hadn't felt this good for so long, but it was burning and coursing through him like fine liquor. He managed to land a blow on the Dark Lord's arm before his own let out a vicious crack and splintered under the force of a silent blow. Harry spun away and backtracked long enough to heal his arm, relying on his ability to dodge quickly and using a spell to create a temporary shield out of the destroyed bits of the platform. With his arm healed, he rushed back into battle, causing the Dark Lord to laugh delightedly at Harry's vicious attack. As they fought, their spells began to grow darker and darker, filling the room with a dark taint, and the smell of roses increased and became nearly intoxicating. Harry gasped suddenly to realize that he was being cheated. Beautiful, aren't they? The Dark Lord said, smirking slyly. I know every flora and fauna known to mankind. Riddle, Harry said, gazing around him as the dark veins began to creep across the walls. In his distraction, the Dark Lord attacked. Harry didn't have a chance, he never did, but especially now. The Dark Lord bodily crashed into him, pinning him to the platform. The effect was immediate. Harry's eyes widened and he arched in absolute pleasure. The Dark Lord let out a low sound, unable to hide his own reaction. Swear to me that you will be mine and only mine. The Dark Lord growled. Harry felt himself choking. Those roses weren't human, but what were they? Swear it, the Dark Lord hissed. Harry arched and whimpered under the impressive will. Magic moved around and through them like a conduit. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I am yours, Harry gasped with wide, terrified eyes. What had he done? What had he just said? He could feel the bindings, the darkness rising and surrounding him. I will never betray you, the Dark Lord swore in return. Harry felt his heart stop at the honesty in those words, in that vow, and he knew that whatever was happening was binding them to their vows. Harry felt the fight fall away from him. He relaxed completely under the man's hold. Somehow he knew what was required of him now, as if magic itself was urging him on. I kneel willingly before you, Harry said softly. Harry gasped as the roses burst into flames all around the room, causing Death Eaters to scramble away from the walls. The flames didn't scorch the walls though, instead they burned. Something inside of him burned and cajoled as he arched from the sensation of it. Mine, the Dark Lord hissed softly. Harry trembled where he lay. What have you done? He breathed. He had never felt so trapped in his life. Red eyes turned and gazed at him lazily. You must have known that you were far too powerful to be simply left alone. I couldn't have you turning to Dumbledore either. I've merely smoothed the pathway for us, he said as though discussing the weather. Harry stared at the man in horror. You have already betrayed me, he whispered, feeling nauseous. The Dark Lord frowned, his gaze darkening suddenly as if only just noticing the state he was in. What you just did, it was worse than beep, Harry whispered, true tears gathering in his eyes. Worse than any pain I've ever been dealt. He hadn't wept in a very long time, but he couldn't hide them now. He turned his head to the side. May I leave now, my lord? He whispered. The Dark Lord climbed to his feet and drew Harry up with him, hands firmly wrapped around Harry's wrists. No, no, I expected anger. The man said in confusion. Why are you this way? He said, his hand coming up to cup Harry's cheek. Harry couldn't help but flinch. Do not fear me, the Dark Lord hissed. Harry was tempted, very tempted to hiss back at him, but he couldn't. There would be no point to it. You are not broken. You cannot be. The spell ensured that you would be mine, but why do you gaze at me so? Why? You were meant to love me. It is the only way. The bond is the only way to ensure that you love me. Only then, only then. The Dark Lord stepped back suddenly, his eyes flickering in thought. Only then. Harry wondered what that meant, but he was so tired, so very exhausted. Go, rest, I will meet with you in a few days. The Dark Lord said then, this time in English. Harry swayed when the man released him and gasped when firm, cool hands caught his shoulders. Severus was white, his lips drawn into a thin, bloodless line as he supported Harry's weight. Harry realized only then how much Severus had grown over the summer, but the thought was whisked away before it could settle. Hadrian, Severus said softly, sounding frightened. Harry leaned against him and pulled out his portkey. He turned and met red eyes as he whispered the activation word. Trust, Harry said before they were being tugged away, leaving the Dark Lord behind. Severus, Madam Prince glanced up at her son worriedly before her eyes darted towards the third room in their cozy apartment. He hasn't left that room for a week, she said softly. Severus, who was poring over a particular text he was assigned to read, only nodded, his lips turning downwards into a frown. Severus, she pleaded. He looked up at her and his gaze shifted, becoming darker and sadder. The Dark Lord did something to him. I don't know what it was, but, well, you've seen him. He's like a ghost, he said, frustrated. Or like a machine. I poked my head in there earlier to tell him I'd be going out and he didn't even look up. His quarters are covered with books and parchment. I couldn't even step through the doorway because there was a pile of scrolls right there waist high. She shook her head and sipped her tea idly. He's a grown man, Mum. He can handle himself, I suppose. Severus said with a helpless shrug. And where did you get to thinking like that? His mother scowled. No man, no matter how grown, is without the need of a bull-headed friend from time to time. She said, standing. Severus felt his jaw drop. Mother, he said hesitantly as she straightened her skirts. Mother, I know he has been kind to us, but I've seen him duel. He is a very, very powerful wizard. You can't simply. His words followed her down the hallway and Severus slipped his eyes closed when he heard the door to Hadrian's room click open. Hadrian didn't even notice she'd arrived. He was quite literally knee-deep in parchment and books, shuffling around the room with quills tucked up in his hair and dark circles under his eyes. His skin was pale and smudged with ink of every color. Right then, some organization first, I suppose, Madam Prince said, cutting through the silence of the room like a knife. She pulled out her wand and flicked it at the parchment, watching as a handy spell made them stack slowly but surely along the walls. Dark green eyes flashed up in surprise and she was hurt to see how empty and hopeless they looked. What are you doing? He said like a child, cocking his head to the side. Helping you, you daft old fool. She said, booking no argument. Now how should I sort these? She said with a proud lift of her chin. Severus shook his head in amusement as he stood in the doorway. Hadrian had always had a weakness towards bossy women. It was 2 days later that Severus was minding the shop when the door chimed open. Severus wouldn't have noticed at all. He was deep in a complex formula that Hadrian had assigned him, but the power rolling through the shop was unmistakable. Severus' head snapped up and he couldn't help the anger that showed in his eyes. My lord, he said softly. Where is he? The Dark Lord demanded, sweeping through the shop. Upstairs, trying to figure out just what it is you've done to him. Severus said calmly, his voice a drawl. Red eyes flickered to him and the Dark Lord narrowed his eyes. I don't appreciate your tone, boy. Remember just who it was that left you in Hadrian's care to begin with. He said dangerously. Severus nodded slowly. Forgive me, my lord, I simply can't help but resent you right now. Hadrian Black has done so much for my mother and he takes so little for himself, yet what little joy he might have had was stolen from him that night at the dueling arena. I fear that your actions may have broken him. Severus said honestly. Ridiculous, he's stronger than that. The Dark Lord said with a wave of his hand. Severus snorted and shook his head sadly. Should I guide you to his room? I doubt he would come out of it. He said idly. What do you mean? The Dark Lord snapped. Why, only that he hasn't left his room since the night we returned from the duel. Severus said silkily. My lord, he added as an afterthought. The Dark Lord's eyes flared with anger before he turned sharply and strode up the stairs. Severus sighed and rubbed his forehead. Had he pushed too hard? He was simply so angry, and he didn't know where to turn. He wasn't used to seeing Hadrian like this. Hadrian was undefeatable, unbreakable and capable of the most wondrous things. It was hard to see now that Hadrian was also just a man like any other, yet bearing more hurt than any other. Hadrian was cursing under his breath, something that Madame Prince often found more amusing than offensive. The man worked without rest, and it was only by her insistence that he ever ate anything at all. A fool, Hadrian whispered before bending over his desk and scribbling away. She rolled her eyes. How many times had she heard him say that? Glancing around the room, she nearly winced. The piles of scrolls and parchment had been organized thanks to her, but they still threatened to creep in on them and overwhelm them at any given moment. She'd spelled shelves onto the walls, all of which were full to the point that she'd at last given up and retrieved crates for the books that wouldn't fit. The door to the room slammed open and she felt her pulse seize at the sight of the man standing in the doorway. Hadrian's gaze jerked up almost as though he'd been shocked from his work. Harry met red eyes and felt anger and frustration curl in his belly. My lord, he said with a sharp nod. What is this? The man said, staring around at the room before striding forward and snatching a quill from Harry's tangled hair. What is this? The man seethed. A quill, my lord, Harry said simply. There was no warmth in his voice. There was nothing in his voice, and that alone was enough to cause the Dark Lord to take a step back. You're furious with me, the man stated, his eyes flickering left and right at the piles upon piles of books and scrolls and bits of parchments. If your intent was to leave me be for a week or two until I calmed down and accepted what you've done to me, Hadrian sneered at the shocked look on the man's face. That was exactly what he'd been planning. Then I'm afraid you failed miserably. Harry said, his voice once again a void. The Dark Lord took a step closer and Hadrian took a step back. If I tell you what I've done, you'll only hate me more. The Dark Lord reasoned. Most likely, however, I will figure it out wither way, even if I have to tear this world apart, and then I will destroy whatever it is you've bound us with. He said, cold simmering rage found just under the surface. You can't, this bond is permanent. The Dark Lord said immediately. Then I will destroy myself. Harry hissed with passion, his eyes ablaze. The Dark Lord was struck speechless. You wouldn't, he said softly. Hadrian rounded on him and stood at his full height, a striking figure despite the quills sticking out from his hair and the ink smudged along his cheek. Care to try me? He challenged. I had very little reason to continue in this world to begin with, but I still had my skills, my freedom. Yet here you come and take that away from me. I have killed for that freedom. I have starved and bled and watched good men die for my freedom, for my peace. And you come along and take it all away from me. For what? Another war. More men dying, more young boys forced to fight in a war that they have no place in, more cannon fodder. Bloody hell, I let you blind me. I let you fill my head with thoughts of battle, let you kindle a darker, deadlier side of me that should have remained silent and unmoved. I should have turned you away the very moment I recognized you for who you were. But the Dark Lord had apparently heard enough, seen enough. In an instant his taller, broader form was slamming Harry against the bookcases along the wall, and lips were claiming his, sending molten lava through his veins. Do you feel this? How out of control this is? The Dark Lord hissed against his mouth before shuddering and drawing him again into a longer, deeper key. I am the Dark Lord. Do you think that I can afford such a weakness? Yet every time I saw you, heard your voice, heard your name whispered, I was drawn to you, to this. He hissed. I had to stop it, Hadrian. If I hadn't, then we both would have been destroyed by this. Hadrian went lax in his arms as he devoured the younger, sweeter mouth, his hands steadying Hadrian as well as they could. Hadrian let out a broken sob, unable to keep from pressing back against the man, unable to stop the lust and the need. What have you done to me? Harry whispered brokenly. I have bound your soul to mine. I have made you mine, the only one who has claim to me. I have made you my consort. The Dark Lord purred, his fingers tracing Harry's jaw slowly. Harry stared at the man with wide uncomprehending eyes. Consort. It wasn't possible. The Dark Lord would never share his throne, not with anyone. And the Dark Lord shall mark him as his equal. No, that prophecy was void. It couldn't be. Yet even as Harry looked to the side where the Dark Lord's fingers were entwined with his, he could see it, the inky tattoo of roses and thorns that wrapped around both of their wrists. He was too shocked to say or do anything. A bit much for a first date, I agree, but I couldn't let it continue. You are everything I can appreciate and respect in another. Never in my life have I met someone that I am as drawn to as I am to you. The Dark Lord said, relaxing his hold somewhat. What were those roses? Harry breathed, asking the only thing he could think to ask. I received the seed from a demon who owed me a favor. They would only have reacted if our souls were compatible. Harry felt a bit of hysterical laughter escape him. Compatible, he repeated. Of course they were compatible. Harry had a bit of the man's soul inside of him. Harry closed his eyes and took deep soothing breaths. Jumping to another timeline hadn't even saved him from his fate. And it never occurred to you to simply ask me to marry you. You know, like every other normal relationship, Harry said, leaning his head forward and resting it against the man's chest. He was so tired of fighting this, of running from it only to be drawn back into it. Great, he was the Dark Lord's consort. He didn't know what the devil to do with that, but it was over and done with, and he was pretty sure there was no getting out of it. Would you have agreed? The Dark Lord asked knowingly. Harry pursed his lips. I would have thought that you were mad. He agreed. I think you're mad anyway though, so nothing changed. He said through his teeth. But now you can't say no. The Dark Lord pointed out, nuzzling his cheek. Harry tried. He really tried not to lean into the touch, but he couldn't help it. The man felt amazing pressed up against him, as though they were a puzzle that simply wouldn't be complete unless they were like this, touching, burning. I want to hate you. Harry said softly, though without conviction. But you can't. I know I am the same. The man said softly. Harry huffed and sighed, but the soothing feeling of safety and warmth that the Dark Lord gave off was just too much. Nothing could happen to him while in this man's arms. That was the feeling he got. For the first time in his life he felt completely and utterly safe and secure. This feels weird, Harry said softly. He felt the man's lips curl where they were pressed against his neck. Allow me to take you to dinner, he said quietly. Harry snorted. A bit late for that, isn't it? He said, though he couldn't keep his own arms from reaching up and wrapping around the man. What if I said please? The man said, pulling away slightly, his eyes glittering slightly. Harry frowned and tapped the man's shoulders in thought. Just dinner. No tricks, Harry said through narrowed eyes. Just dinner. No tricks. The Dark Lord said, smirking. Harry knew that he'd left for a lot of loopholes, but then their relationship would never be a normal one. He sighed softly and nodded. Fine, he said, huffing a bit. The Dark Lord smirked and lifted Harry's chin, pressing a key to his lips that he supposed was intended to be chaste, except that nothing between them was ever chaste. The key deepened and heated before the Dark Lord pulled away, his lower lip bloodied from Harry's attentions. You should keep that. I do like leaving my mark, Harry said, licking his own swollen lips. The Dark Lord licked the blood away with a smirk. How uncouth, he said, quirking an eyebrow. I will return at 7, formal attire, my pet, he said before reluctantly pulling away. Harry let out a sigh and winced as he was released. The man had slammed him against those bookshelves so hard that he was sure to have bruises. Pet, Harry scoffed. You wish, he said, tugging at his robes. The man hummed and gave him a lingering look before turning sharply and striding from the room. Harry stood in the wreckage, feeling very much the way he always did when Voldemort inevitably walked away triumphant. Blast that man, he said, seething. Feeling better, Mr. Black? Harry had completely forgotten about Madam Prince, but she was giving him an all too familiar look, one that had frequented Snape's expression when the man looked at him. Oh, bugger off, Harry said, snatching the quills from his hair in annoyance. Madam Prince. Laughter followed him all the way to the bathroom as he tried and failed to stride away with his dignity intact. So you mean to tell me that the bloke who came to my house is actually Hadrian Black? Lily said, sitting across from Severus, her nose screwed up in thought. Severus found the expression adorable, not that he'd ever admit it out loud. They were seated in the kitchen, books sprawled out around them from where they'd been finishing up some last-minute Transfiguration homework. Yes, I don't know how he did it, but he said something about being frozen in time, as if he can't age normally like the rest of us. Severus said, scribbling something down in his notes. Just then the bell downstairs rang and Severus tensed, reaching out and grasping Lily's hand thoughtlessly. The Dark Lord stepped up the stairs and sneered briefly at Lily before addressing Severus, who was more preoccupied by the enormous bouquet of flowers. "Severus, do tell me you aren't actually considering marrying the mudblood," he said, wrinkling his nose. "My lord, do tell me you didn't arrive insulting my houseguests and bringing me flowers of all things," Hadrian said from where he had suddenly appeared in the hallway. With a flick of his wand the bouquet exploded into flames. Lady Malfoy insisted that it was courting ritual to bring flowers. The Dark Lord said, banishing the flaming affair. "And why would Lady Malfoy be privy to the idea that you would be courting me?" Harry asked lightly. "Well, I had to give her some reason for the fantastic ball she's throwing tonight now, didn't I?" he said with a smirk. Harry twitched. "A ball," he repeated. "Funny thing, I remember agreeing to dinner," he said silkily. "Of course, dinner will be served at 9 in the Malfoy Conservatory, lovely room I might add," the man said, enjoying every moment of it. Harry sighed. "Anything else I should know?" he asked lightly as he reached for his canteen and took a long draw. "You look stunning." Harry nearly choked on his drink. He did in fact look stunning. He was dressed the very part of a pure blood of the very highest class, not that he would ever admit to doing it for the Dark Lord's benefit, which was the very reason he was choking now. The Dark Lord had figured him out in an instant. "Yes, and so do you, but you already knew that, didn't you?" Harry said dryly as he screwed the top back onto his canteen and slipped it away. The Dark Lord had dressed up too, it seemed, high-collar robes, nicely cut to show his impressive figure. Nothing too ostentatious, yet at the same time anyone looking would be able to tell that he was filthy rich. "Of course, now my pet, shall we?" he said, smirking. Harry gazed at the outstretched arm cautiously before sighing and reaching out. "Mine," the Dark Lord said, activating the portkey. Harry scowled and leaned closer as they spun rapidly before being deposited in a large lavish sitting room which he could see was already occupied by several Inner Circle members who all stood and bowed to the Dark Lord, their eyes lingering on Harry. "What, no mask?" Harry asked, leaning closer to the Dark Lord, who smirked. "Of course not. This ball was designed to mark the beginning of a proper courting ritual. Why would I hide the face of my intended?" the Dark Lord said smugly. Harry felt his stomach sink. "It was what? Oh bloody hell, I should have stayed in my lab," he said, rubbing his nose in frustration. "Is this your idea of fun then?" he questioned wryly. "Tormenting me," he said, his lips twitching despite himself. "Quite. Now we must adjourn to the other room and properly greet our hosts, don't you agree?" the man said smugly. "Pet," he added just to make Harry twitch. "You said no tricks." Harry nearly sulked as he was guided from the room. There was a smile playing about his lips, though. A part of him, no matter how annoyed, was secretly thrilled at this. The Dark Lord wasn't keeping him a secret. He wasn't at all ashamed of Harry. The man caught sight of the smile and relaxed slightly. "I didn't trick you, not when you knew I was going to do something anyway," the man said, lifting his chin. "Besides, it's almost as if you enjoy when I torment you," he said silkily. Harry scoffed, though it was a weak attempt to cover himself. "I'll admit I enjoy a challenge." And wasn't that an understatement? Harry adored the way the Dark Lord could make his blood boil. Ah, my lord. Harry had never met Lady Malfoy before. He made a point of avoiding social circles, but he had to admit, he now understood where Lucius got his beauty. Harry now understood the rumors of the Malfoy family having Vila in their blood. "Lady Malfoy, as beautiful as ever I see," the Dark Lord charmed. "May I introduce you officially to my intended, Hadrian Black," he said, guiding Harry forward. Harry didn't like it, but he knew the steps to this particular dance well enough. "Lady Malfoy," he said, bowing slightly, "it is an honor to meet you. My intended was just telling me what great lengths you've gone to in order to prepare this ball in our honor. I can't tell you how grateful I am for your efforts," he said, flawlessly causing the Dark Lord to raise a bow and Lady Malfoy to blush brightly in shock and appreciation. No doubt her husband had given her the details of their duel. "Oh gracious me, how kind of you. It was no trouble at all," she said, smiling a full kind smile that made Harry like her immediately. Lucius had gotten his cruelty from his father, that much was obvious, yet his grace and mannerisms came directly from his mother. Harry's gaze flickered up when Lord Malfoy arrived at the scene, dressed formally and wearing a look of slight curiosity rather than the uppity look he'd been wearing before. Harry noted that the man's expression smoothed out upon reaching them. Pleasantries were exchanged, greetings made, and the general small talk was uttered as they stepped towards the ballroom, the Dark Lord's arm ever present, crooked around his hand as though half expecting Harry to make a run for it. Harry wouldn't do that though. As annoying as these social functions were, he knew their importance. Especially one that was centered around a relationship like this one. Society either accepted it as a whole or did everything in their power to force it to end. So Harry played his part to the best of his abilities, startling a majority of the guests. Lord Black had trained him well after all. He wasn't about to shame the man's name even after death. "You're perfect," the Dark Lord said as they finally managed to find a few moments to themselves. Harry tilted his gaze up and quirked his eyebrow. "Well, obviously," he drawled, making the man snort. "I've never found someone with as much poise as you, Hadrian. I'll not lie, I had worried that your rougher edges would come out at the face of society," he said, taking a sip of wine. Their heads were tilted close together in intimacy and Harry couldn't help but smile a bit at that. "I thought you liked it rough," he said softly. He gratified to see the Dark Lord's cheeks tinge pink before a heated possessive look returned to him. "I do. Why else would I tease you so much?" he said, startling Harry by leaning forward suddenly and pressing a key to the side of his head. It was Harry's turn to blush, looking at the man in shock. "You were oddly sweet at times, did you know that?" Harry mused, a small smile on his lips. "What did you think that simply because I enjoy the finer arts of torture that I wouldn't be capable of giving you what you need?" the man said, mildly surprised. Harry frowned. No, a part of him knew that Voldemort was capable of giving him everything he could ever need and want, and that's what frightened him. "Need," Harry said, blinking. The Dark Lord nodded slowly. "Perhaps it is the bond, but I instinctively know that you need contact, a great deal of contact, almost as though you've never been touched or held in your life," the man said with a frown. Harry nodded slowly and looked down at the roses tattooed around their wrists. "Hadrian," the man said softly. Harry glanced up at him. "Is what I'm feeling true?" he said, a slightly annoyed frown on his lips. "My mother died when I was a year old," Harry said, looking away. "The place I was sent to, the people there didn't like me, they hated my magic and shunned me. They didn't touch me except to hurt me," he admitted before sipping on his wine. The Dark Lord nodded slowly. "So then this much at least was true of what you told me, you lived your childhood without love," he said quietly. Harry nodded sharply. "It doesn't matter now," he said stiffly. "I don't need love. Love destroys everything it touches, it corrupts and poisons, it is like a potion that makes the drinker think that it is a good thing, but it is deceptive and in the end it only causes more pain," he said, thinking of Elizabeth. "I think that you are lying," the Dark Lord said with a small smile. "No, in fact I'm sure that you are lying. You've been hurt, yes, very, very hurt, but you do need love, you thrive on it. Without love you are lost and without purpose," the man said, assured. Harry felt as though the man had driven a stake into his heart. "And your instincts tell you this," Harry said bitterly. The Dark Lord glanced down at him and sighed softly. "Yes, they give me the ability to see what you need. But enough of this, it is obviously distressing you and I only want to see smiles from you tonight," the Dark Lord said with a lift of his chin. "Pet," he added, making Harry's scowl fade into a look of incredulous amusement. The Dark Lord smirked in triumph before leaning forward and pressing another key to his head. Harry couldn't help but smile then, all dark thoughts washed from him. "I must admit I had my reservations about Mr. Black," Lady Malfoy said as she watched the two chattering across the room. She had known their lord for a very, very long time. Never had she seen him look at anyone the way he looked at Hadrian Black. "But I must say, I'm impressed," she said, taking a sip from her wine. Just like that she knew that she'd eased Black's way completely. When one had the respect of Lord and Lady Malfoy, one was embraced wholeheartedly. "He is quite handsome, isn't he?" one lady said with a soft giggle. Those eyes. Another said, fanning herself. And ever so charming. Another said with a smile. Lady Malfoy glanced across the room at where her husband stood and smiled lightly, offering the man a nod. She knew Abraxas well. The man had a mind for business, not for society, so he looked to her when it came to matters such as these. Her husband offered her a small half-smile before making his own statement, causing the men to begin to do the same as the ladies were doing. Hadrian Black, aside from his potions being a global sale, there was rumor that the man had tricks up his sleeves, plans for the future that would expand his business and make him potentially the most wealthy man in the world. They were only rumors, and there were no details given, but she found that she could believe it looking at the young man. No one would expect it once he was teaching in Hogwarts, but he was up to something big. She smiled and turned back to the conversation at hand. She had work to do after all. Harry had drunk too much, of that he was certain. The ball had been long and drawn out, and the only way to keep from killing some of the people he'd been forced to be friendly with was to drink copious amounts of champagne and wine. Now, Hadrian was no lightweight. He could drink with the best of them and still be sober enough to fight in battle, which was a testimony to how much wine and champagne he'd actually drunk by the time the night was through. He didn't look it, of course. He looked completely in control. He'd had enough training to appear so, but he was quite drunk by the time the last of the guests slipped away into the night. "My lord," he said stiffly as the Dark Lord began to lead him away. Red eyes turned towards him in mild amusement. "I'm positively smashed," Harry said with a slow nod. The Dark Lord let out a short laugh at his assessment. "I should think so. I had trouble keeping up with you, you know," he said lightly. Harry turned to him and stared at him for a long moment, his eyes suspicious. "You're smashed too, aren't you?" he said with an exaggerated nod. The Dark Lord snorted slightly and nodded. "I'm almost certain that I am," he said graciously. Harry let out a giggle. "You did it to withstand the biddy with the hairpiece, didn't you? The one with ostrich feathers all over the top of her PPPPFTTT." And then he was laughing, the Dark Lord joining in after a moment. "Merlin, this is so undignified," the Dark Lord said, burying his face into Harry's neck. Harry nodded as he got hold of himself. "I shouldn't let anyone see you like this," Harry announced with a grave nod. "Most certainly," the Dark Lord agreed. "We should say our goodbyes to the Malfoys," Harry said, swinging around to find the couple only to frown. "Oh, they're gone," he noted blankly. The Dark Lord buried his face in Harry's neck and laughed again. "Merlin Black, did you see those feathers?" he sniggered. Harry grinned and pulled out his portkey before frowning. "Damn, I can't remember the key word for this," he said, staring at it as though he had the mental ability to make it work. The Dark Lord chortled and pulled out his portkey. "It's fine, I have one. It will only get us to the door of your shop though, I'm afraid," he said in all seriousness. Harry nodded with him. "We better take some wine just in case," he said, though he couldn't for the life of him figure out why. The Dark Lord agreed though, and several moments later they'd grabbed up several bottles of high-quality wine before the Dark Lord grabbed hold of him and they slipped away into the night. "I don't think I've ever seen him drunk before," Abraxas noted from where he and his wife had been watching the two. Lady Malfoy snorted delicately into her hand. "Oh, let them be, my love. Our Lord doesn't smile like that nearly enough," she said in amusement. Her husband snorted. "They took the wine," he noted in amusement. "Hush, my love," his wife said, though she too was grinning. They'd made it up the stairs with little loss. Harry had lost his cloak along the way and the Dark Lord's hair tie had shot away while they were keying, but the bottles in their arms were quite snug and safe. They came upon Severus in the dining room. It was apparent that he'd fallen asleep studying, but with all the noise they made it was no wonder he was blinking up at them. Harry adjusted the bottles in his arms and pressed his finger to his lips exaggeratedly. "Shush, Severus is sleeping," he said, causing the Dark Lord to burst into peals of laughter. "You twit, that is Severus," he drawled. Harry scowled for a moment in thought before nodding. "Ooh," he said slowly before allowing the Dark Lord to prod him towards his room. He stumbled a bit, but the man caught him before he could actually fall, though he did drop a bottle at one point which was scooped up with no small amount of concentration. Harry slipped into his room and closed the door behind him. "I can't remember how to cast a silencing charm," he said slowly. "Never mind that," the Dark Lord said, popping the top off one of the bottles. We have wine. Good wine, he said with a nod. And I will share this wine with you, my consort, he said seriously. Pff, you sound like a caveman. Harry jeered as he staggered towards the man and fell into the chair before scowling. I hate this chair, he announced as the bottle was handed to him. Then come sit on my lap. The Dark Lord offered, a small bit of heat in his voice. Harry couldn't find anything wrong with the notion and took a deep draw of the wine before staggering over to where the man had seated himself and plopping himself across the man's lap. Much better, Harry announced before handing the bottle over. The Dark Lord drank deeply before nuzzling Harry's neck, making him wrinkle his nose. You wipe your mouth before doing that, he said, reaching back to wipe the man's mouth. Instead, by no fault of his own, he was keying the man. It was sloppy and they were far too drunk to do anything more, but it was good, so good and so right, and he had no problem telling the Dark Lord that he thought so. My consort, the man gasped as they keyed. My pet, he whispered. Harry groaned as he woke. His mouth tasted like ass, his throat felt like cotton had been shoved down it, and his stomach was not happy with him. What the F*** did I do? Ron D, you have a hangover potion, he said blearily. Another groan joined his. Merciful Merlin, what the hell prompted you to holler like that? A voice croaked. You're the one yelling. Besides, you aren't Ron, Harry said, wincing as the world suddenly tilted on its axis. It took him a moment to realize that he was sprawled over the man who was apparently in his room and apparently half naked. He still wasn't Ron though. Of course I'm not. I'm O for F*** s sake your hair. The man winced, turning his face away in disgust. Harry scowled and wrinkled his nose. My hair, he said blearily. I'm going to be sick, the man stated before summarily throwing Harry off of him and rushing for the loo. Harry growled and winced, his head aching fiercely. The F*** happened, he muttered to himself before dragging himself to the chair. He gazed around at the trashed suit and slowly things came back to him. Ah, he was Hadrian Black here, wasn't he? And those were a lot of bottles, and they were all empty. Here, Harry winced at the volume of the voice and the sound of the potion's vial clinking against the surface of his table. Hangover potion, the man said before sitting across the table from him and burying his face in his arms. Harry swallowed thickly and drank the potion down in 2 gulps, leaning his head back to wait for it to work. Best stuff I ever made, hangover potion, Harry said eventually. The Dark Lord mumbled in agreement. What happened last night? The man said slowly, looking up, his lips turning upwards in amusement. Something happened to your hair, I know that much, he said, chuckling. Harry scowled and summoned a mirror. Of course, he was sporting a Slytherin green mohawk. I don't even know how the F*** I did that, Harry said, tilting his head to the side. Well, fix it, as humorous as it is, it's making me ill, the Dark Lord said, burying his face in his arms again. Harry scowled at the man and flicked his wand at his hair, returning it to its usual black cascade. I feel nasty, Harry said, setting the mirror down. Shower, the other man offered, standing unsteadily. Most definitely, Harry agreed, accepting the hand that reached for him. I have a hard time remembering the details, the Dark Lord said as they stepped into the bathroom. But I believe I was trying to teach you to dance the salsa last night, he said, amused. Harry snorted. Damn, and I can't remember a thing, he said, turning the spray on. This touch, this being taken care of, it felt good. He sighed as the Dark Lord poured soap onto a sponge and began washing him carefully. You do have the most wonderful body, the Dark Lord said, pressing a key to his shoulder. Harry turned so that he could face the man and leaned gratefully into the broad chest. I could say the same about you, he said lazily. Still tired? The Dark Lord asked, peppering keys across his shoulder and neck. Harry sighed and tilted his head to the side. Yeah, can't hardly stand up. We should eat though. His lips were suddenly occupied and Harry forgot what he was going to say as hands became more searching and teasing, their arousals brushing against each other deliciously. Oh God, Harry gasped as the Dark Lord pulled away only briefly to lift him and wrap his legs around his waist. The man growled softly before nipping his bottom lip and drawing him in for another key. Lube, the man demanded softly. Harry summoned the tube from his bedside, hardly noticing that it crashed through the solid wooden door to get to him. He handed the man the bottle and gasped as slick fingers began to enter him. "There are spells for that, you know." "Oh," Harry muttered, clinging to the man as he was stretched. "I prefer it this way," the Dark Lord rasped. "Please." Harry wanted it now. He didn't care if it burned. The Dark Lord groaned at this, and Harry felt himself being shifted before suddenly the slick organ was slowly pushing into him. It had been so long since anyone had taken him like this, and it felt so very good. He beeped long and loud as he was breached, the burn and the aching sting of it only making it more intense. "Please, please, please," Harry begged, his nails biting into the man's shoulders as he moved. Harry gasped as the length withdrew before crashing into him, roughly stealing his breath before withdrawing and shifting and then entering again, this time making him scream with the pleasure of it. There was no stopping this. He was made mindless by it, the fire that burned through him, leaving him to be less human and more animal. He key-ed and nipped and was bitten and key-ed and ed hard and fast the way he knew he needed to be, the urgency growing and burning until all he could do was cry out and beg for more. Harder, faster, more, rising higher and higher as coils of pleasure tightened inside of him, tighter and tighter until he didn't know if he could take it anymore, and then he was aware only of screaming as he reached completion, his head knocking back against the tile wall as stars exploded in his vision. The Dark Lord reached up and cradled the back of his head as he continued to pound inside him, carrying him through his orgasm before, with a deep thrust that took his breath, the man came deep inside him. A blossom of pleasure washed over him at the sensation, and Harry shuddered as he slowly came down from his high, panting and letting out small noises of contentment as the Dark Lord nipped and key-ed along his neck and jaw. I think I'll keep you," Harry said lazily once he could think straight. The Dark Lord snorted and helped him to his feet, though Harry found he had to lean heavily against the other man. "I love shower say," the Dark Lord said happily before bending down to pick up the sponge and carefully continuing to wash Harry. "You don't have to do that," Harry said, leaning back against the wall for support. The man smiled up at him and captured his hand, pressing a key to it. "And miss out on being able to touch all of you," the man said smugly. Harry snorted. "Figures your reasoning would be self-serving," he muttered. The Dark Lord nipped at his inner thigh, making him gasp. "Hush, pet," he said, handing Harry the sponge. Harry smiled faintly and added more soap before beginning to wash the other man, taking his time to slide his hands across the well-toned body, licking his lips as his blood began to pound again, heat pouring through them. "What the hell is this?" Harry asked, leaning against the Dark Lord for support when the touch became too heady again. The Dark Lord pulled him into his arms and sighed softly. "I don't know, but we will be fine either way, I'll make certain of it," he said, pressing a key to the top of his head before pouring shampoo into his hair and lathering it gently. Harry smiled and shivered at the feel of the man's fingers working their way through his hair. "No one's ever done this for me before," Harry admitted quietly. The hands hesitated briefly before pushing his head back into the spray. "Then I suppose we'll have to fix that, won't we?" the Dark Lord said before pouring a potion into his hair that worked to condition and soften his hair. "I own this potion," the man mused, turning them gently. Harry smiled slightly. "One of my top sellers. I invented it for Severus, you know," he said, reaching up to lather the man's hair, sliding his fingers through the mass slowly and patiently. "Severus. I do recall he had rather appalling hygiene before," the man said mildly. "I fixed his nose for him too," Harry said with a smirk. "Yes, I did notice that. He looks much better now," Harry snorted. "Don't mention it to him, I think he's trying to forget it happened," he said mildly as he guided the man back and stood on his toes to help rinse the soap away. I think I'll have you brush my hair from now on, I do like the feel of you so close," the man said, bending forward slightly and encircling him with his arms. Harry sighed in delight before the man pulled away and poured the potion into his hair. "I think I've marked you, my lord," Harry said, tracing one of the red lines that crossed the man's shoulders from where he'd scratched him. "You should see yourself, pet, though I must say you don't look as ravished as I would like you to look," he purred, leaning Harry under the water again and keying him through the spray as the potion washed away. Harry let out a small beep and wrapped his arms around the man. There was no denying this now that he had been there, had reached that high, he knew he was addicted. Beautiful, the man said as they separated. Harry smiled faintly and guided the man back to wash the potion from his hair. A wicked thought entered his mind and he smirked up at the man whose head was tipped back, his eyes closed. Harry leaned up and pressed open-mouthed keys to the arched neck, causing the Dark Lord's breath to catch in his throat as he wandered down, stopping to nibble on the collarbone before slowly mapping his way down the expanse of beautiful golden skin. He nipped and nibbled and bit and laved, sliding his tongue into the man's navel when he reached it, and ing it with his tongue before sliding further until he reached his prize. Then he gazed up at the man, making sure to meet red eyes as he dropped to his knees. "My lord," he said softly before slipping the length into his mouth. The Dark Lord let out a low guttural sound, his hands coming to wind into his hair as he took the length deeper. Harry inhaled the masculine scent and took the length deeper, hungry for the feel of it sliding further. He relaxed his throat and Riddle let out a strangled sound as it slid deeper still, all the way to the base. Harry swallowed around it and flickered his eyes up, challenging red eyes. The Dark Lord gripped his hair then, and Harry groaned as his head was yanked back suddenly and then pushed forward again, the pace becoming so that all he could do was hold on to the man's thighs and accept the intrusion. He loved it. He may hate that he loved it, but there was no denying it, that someone had the balls to do this. No, that the Dark Lord had the balls to do this, to claim him this way. It was all Harry could possibly need or want. He found himself going to a higher place again, not worried about choking or breathing because he knew that the Dark Lord wouldn't let him get hurt. He was possessive that way. He could just float away, surrounded by the man's scent and the charge that moved between them. He gasped as he was pulled back suddenly and groaned when the man came smattering him with it as he panted for air. "Now look what you've done," Harry accused. "You've gone and made me all dirty again," he said, smirking slightly as he poked his tongue out and licked some of the mess away. Heated red eyes flared and panting lips quirked. "I apologize, next time I'll have you swallow," he said lightly. Harry snorted. "It's been 3 days," Severus said as his mother poured her tea and picked up the morning mail. "Newlyweds," she said, her lips twitching. "Should we check on them?" Severus said, ignoring the comment. "They'll come up for air sometime," she said, a full-blown smirk stretched across her lips. "You're happy for him?" Severus said, surprised. "He's found a bit of happiness." Severus, "After all that he's given us, do you really think I wouldn't be happy that he's found someone who makes him smile? The man might be a Dark Lord, but he's good for Hadrian. You can see it in the way he looks at him," she pointed out. Severus rolled his eyes. "He looks at him like he wants to eat him," he said dryly. "He looks at him the way you look at Lily Evans." His mother counted knowingly. Severus nearly spit out his tea. "Mother," he said, huffing. His mother simply smirked knowingly before turning her gaze to her letters. All was well in the Black household. The rest of that summer sped by. For Severus, it was spent studying and preparing for when Hadrian would finally deem him ready to begin practical work. For Madame Black, it was spent rebuilding bridges with her estranged father and getting back onto her feet. For Harry, it was another matter altogether. While there were times when the Dark Lord was gone for a few hours, the man positively refused to be away from him for very long. Harry found it both endearing and frustrating. On the one hand, he spent most of his days in such absolute bliss that when the man wasn't there, he was left feeling like a rag that had been wrung out too many times. On the other hand, when the man was gone, he was left feeling like a rag that had been wrung out too many times, which meant that working was a trial. It seemed that business was better than ever, and even making things in large quantities as he wasn't enough to keep up with the demand. So with little trepidation, as the summer came to a close, Harry assigned some of the lower-grade potions to Severus. The young man was more than eager to get into his forbidden lab, and Harry had to admit that his potions were just as good as Harry's. But still, the summer came to a close, and all too soon Harry was facing returning to Hogwarts and feeling mildly put out by the idea. "I will visit you often," the Dark Lord murmured beside him as he stared at the suddenly intimidating Hogwarts Express. They'd said their goodbyes earlier, goodbyes that Harry's ass and mouth were still smarting from, but still, it somehow didn't seem right. "You'd better. My body's gotten used to you. I don't know what I'll do without all that say," he muttered in slight annoyance, which in turn caused the man to smile smugly, his fingers reaching out to caress the spot on his neck where Harry knew there were teeth marks and red spots that he'd had to glamour. "If you have to wank, send me pictures," the man said into his ear. Harry flushed and shivered. You fiend, Harry said, his eyes flashing towards the man heatedly. Harry couldn't deny, the man was creative and everything that he came up with so far had been. His eyes glazed over. Go on, my pet, you can't be late for school, the man said, smirking. Now there's an idea, I'll see if I can't snatch one of the girls' uniforms, Harry said with a grin. This time it was the Dark Lord's eyes that glazed over. Make sure it's Gryffindor, the man said in all seriousness. Harry snorted and winked at him as the train whistled loudly. I'll see what I can do, Mr. Riddle, he said with a mock bow before darting towards the train. Professors were meant to sit in the front compartment if they rode with the students, which for some reason the headmaster had asked him to do, but Harry had never really been one for rules, so he was content to wander down the train as it started up. An evil sort of smirk crossed his features as he came upon the compartment where Severus and Lily were sitting. With a quick glance around, he cast a notice me not charm on the door. Give the two a train ride alone, he thought to himself before absently flicking his wand to lock the door. Ooh, being a professor was going to be fun. Hey Moony, James said as his friend slipped into the compartment. It had been a long summer. After Peter had died, he and his parents had been hounded relentlessly by the Aurors. And then not 2 weeks after they finally left him alone, they came back asking about Peter's father, who'd apparently gone missing. James had been to the ministry more times than he could count, and his parents were hassled every time they went out. The worst part was that the ministry had found out about Sirius staying at his house. They forced his parents to return him to the Black family. James hadn't heard from him since. Hey James, Remus said, wincing as he sat down before promptly lying on his back and rolling onto his side. Tough night, James said knowingly. It was worse than usual. Moony seems to know that Peter's dead. It feels like a pack mate has been killed, he said, wrinkling his nose. The door slid open and James frowned at the sight of the tall man with bright green eyes and long dark hair. Ah, hello boys, my name is Hadrian Black, the man said, frowning at them curiously. You're the one that took Snape in, Remus said knowingly. The man nodded before gazing at Remus for a moment and reaching into his pocket. Here, this will help with the pain, he said, holding out a potion. Remus' eyes widened in terror. Oh, don't worry, unlike some of my family members, I could care less if you sprout fur every month so long as you keep your teeth away from my charge, he said mildly, though with an edge to his voice. In fact, shall we make an accord? I'm currently working on a potion that will ease the way each month if you and your little friends agree to keep well enough away from Severus the First. Might just be willing to supply you with the necessary potions, he said with a decidedly Slytherin smirk. How do we know you'll keep your word? James Potter demanded. The man frowned slightly at him before speaking. Has no one told you that we are family? He said, raising his eyebrows. James paled drastically. It's in the ministry archives if you care to look. Darlene Potter was my mother's name, he said with a nod. Don't go spreading that around though, boy, do you understand? Your grandparents rather don't like me, he said mildly. Remus took the potion and James watched to see if he would turn blue or something. Instead, Remus' body relaxed completely. My God, I feel like I haven't been through a transformation at all, Remus said, wide-eyed. Thank you, I am rather good at what I do. Now I must be off, but do think of my offer him. Come see me in my office if you make up your mind, he said, nodding at them before stepping out of the compartment and letting the door slip closed. James, Remus said. His gaze was pleading and James felt his determination fall. Was it that good? He said, sneering slightly. Remus dropped his eyes and nodded, making him relent. We'll back off then. Besides, with Newts this year I doubt we'll have any time for pranking, and it won't be the same without Wormtail tagging along, he said, turning his gaze to the window. Harry frowned as he stepped out of the last compartment. If he had been worried before, he was doubly worried now. He hadn't seen Sirius Black in any of the compartments, and he'd been up and down the train checking at least 3 times. Something was wrong. Harry scowled slightly as the train continued to move, making its way across the countryside with nary a thought to its missing student. Harry worried his bottom lip as he began to make his way towards the front of the train. He stopped to check in with the head boys and girls, made sure that the wards on the train were intact, and then with a troubled mind stepped into the teacher's compartment. He would speak to the headmaster immediately. Sirius might have been a hellion as a child, but in his time the man had given Harry hope, had been there for him when no one else understood. He owed the man a debt no matter the date. Besides, if his suspicions were correct, then Sirius desperately needed someone to find him. He tucked his legs up into one of the seats and pulled out a book, hardly able to focus though he did try. Merlin. He hadn't even gotten to Hogwarts and there was trouble. Are you certain? The headmaster was pale. Harry had told him almost the moment he'd arrived at Hogwarts. The man had immediately flowed the Potters, who had told him just what Harry had feared. Sirius had been returned to his family. I'm going to get him. As a member of the Black family I have every right. Harry said coldly. Hadrian. But Harry was already stepping into the flow, calling out a name that he'd never thought he would call out again. Number 12 Grimmauld Place, he rasped. In an instant he was spinning away, flashes of other fireplaces and homes rushing about him before he was deposited into a very familiar room. You. Harry turned abruptly and caught sight of the old man. He might have changed over the years, his hair gone white, his teeth yellowed and his skin sagging and paper thin, but Harry knew him immediately. Arcturus, Harry said with a sneer. The air around him grew cold. Here to kill an old man. To finish me at last, the man said, his eyes filled with wildfire. Harry sneered. Father, who the hell are you? Harry looked at the man and recognized him as the boy he'd known a very, very long time ago. Arcturus. Grandchild. This is the great Hadrian Black. Arcturus said with flashing eyes as he cackled madly. You were poison to your family, Arcturus, just as father said. Harry hissed. You would run your family into the mud with your madness. He said, shaking his head. Oh, that's rich coming from the man who sold himself to the Dark Lord. The man hissed. Harry stiffened. Oh, don't think I don't know, it's the talk of society lately. There you were so noble in defending our father, and yet there you were in the place that I should have taken. Harry sneered. The least you deserve, besides I'm not here for you. Where is Sirius? He hissed, turning to the other man in the room. The man was pale though, and Harry could see his hand go to his arm as he watched Hadrian with new light. Forgive me, my lord, he's in his room. The man said, taking a step back. Harry sneered. I'm not your lord. If you must treat me with respect, which I highly suggest that you do, refer to me with respect but not with that title. That title belongs to my lord only. He seethed, unable to believe that he was defending this. Yes, sir, of course, the man said, bowing his head. Take me to him, Harry demanded. Don't you walk away from me, Hadrian. Arcturus hollered before falling into fits of coughing. Curl up and die, you waste of space. Harry sneered before rushing up the stairs, following the man to a very familiar room. Harry's lips thinned as the man shakily pulled out a set of keys and unlocked the doors. You will sign Sirius into my care immediately. Harry hissed coldly. The man pressed his lips into a thin line but nodded sharply. Harry narrowed his eyes. Well, go to the ministry and have the paperwork drawn up before I turn you into a sniveling mess. He snarled. The man jerked back before rushing down the stairs. Harry took a deep, calming breath before pushing the door open. Wide blue-gray eyes peeked out at him from a too-thin face. The boy was trembling, and Harry had to swallow back a distressed sound as the medic in him noted the man's injuries. Sirius, he said softly. The boy shrank back, fire gone from his eyes. I'm here to help, Harry explained softly. I've come from Hogwarts. He added. The boy's eyes flickered with a spark of recognition. Will you come sit on your bed so that I can heal you? Harry said softly. Sirius gazed at him distrustfully before carefully creeping out from where he was crouched, wincing with every step he took until he settled on the bed. Harry sighed as he noted the fear in the boy's eyes. Sirius, I would like you to take this. It will put you to sleep, and when you next wake you will be in Hogwarts, safely tucked in bed, all right? Harry said, handing the boy a dreamless sleep. Sirius eyed it warily and then eyed him warily before nodding, his hands shaking as he drank the potion. Harry helped guide the boy until he was laying down. Oh my lord, I didn't see you there. Harry grit his teeth as he began to scan Sirius. He really didn't need to deal with Sirius, mum, right now. I am not your lord. You may address me with respect, but the title of lordship belongs to my lord. He said for what felt like the millionth time. I will be taking Sirius. He added after a moment as he expertly began to heal the many wounds. Be glad that I don't kill you for what you've done to this child," he added before pouring another potion down Sirius' throat. "As it is, I will be speaking to my lord about this," he said before carefully scooping the small body into his arms and lifting him from the bed, turning to stare at the wide-eyed woman whose bottom lip was trembling. "But sir, we were only doing what was best. He has these notions, sir, about the mudbloods. He's been a disgrace to our family." "He is a child still, madam, your son. And you hurt him grievously." "I know, my lord, and I know that he wouldn't stand for this," he said confidently. "Now if you'll excuse me," he said, brushing by her. "Forgive me, sir, had I known." "It doesn't matter, madam. Your excuses are weak and I tire of them. If you must insist on giving them to someone, give them to my lord. He has far more patience than I do," he said, stepping down the stairs and back into the parlor just as the flames flared to life and Sirius' father strode through, grim-faced with documents in hand. "They only need your signature, sir," he said, settling the scroll onto Sirius' sleeping form. "The boy will be tainted if he goes with him." Arcturus sneered. Harry rolled his eyes and tossed powder into the flow. "Hogwarts headmaster's office," Harry said shortly before striding through. His balance was slightly thrown with Sirius in his arms, but he didn't care even when he stumbled upon being ejected from the flow. "Hadrian," the headmaster said, standing swiftly and coming around to help him. Harry let out a hiss though and pulled Sirius away. "How many more, Albus?" he cried out furiously. "How many more children will I have to take in because you refused to see that they were hurting? They used the Cruciatus curse on him, for God's sake. Don't even get me started on what Severus' father was doing to him. You have an obligation to these children," he growled before turning sharply, intending to place Sirius onto one of the couches so that he could heal him better, only to freeze at the sight of the two wide-eyed boys. "Shit," he hissed before taking a deep breath. "Mr. Black," the headmaster said sharply. Harry sighed loudly. "Budge over, Lupin, I've a boy to heal," he said softly before carefully laying Sirius onto the couch. His eyes caught sight of the legal documents and he summoned a quill and some ink, signing them with a flourish before setting them to the side and pulling out his wand, healing the wound slowly and methodically, pausing every once in a while to pour another potion down Sirius' throat. "You've taken guardianship of him," the headmaster said, having picked up the documents. "Yes," Harry said as he waved his wand over Sirius, using a bathing spell that would leave him slightly damp but cleaner for it. "You have a good heart, Mr. Black," the headmaster said after a moment. Harry snorted and called the elf for a spare pair of clean pajamas. "No, headmaster, I am a man like any other. I have a dark side, and I do and say bad things, but I would not stand by to see a child beaten. I am not you," he said coldly. The headmaster couldn't say anything to that. He simply sat behind his desk and watched as Harry magically changed Sirius into clean clothing before wrapping him into a blanket and tucking him safely into his arms. "Potter, Lupin, I'll take Sirius to my quarters tonight. I have a feeling he will need some space. I'll call you when he is ready for visitors, all right?" he said, grabbing up the documents as he lifted Sirius into his arms, which was no easy feat considering the 7th year was about as large as he was. "Good night, Professor Black," the headmaster said softly. Harry gave the man a considering look before shaking his head. "Good night, headmaster," he said before carrying Sirius down the steps. "Tom wasn't going to like this. You can't help yourself, can you?" the Dark Lord said idly as he sipped his tea. It had been a week since Harry had taken Sirius and the young man was healing well, but he still came to Harry's quarters to do his homework. Sirius said it was because the noise in the common room bothered him, but Harry knew differently. It was hard being around people that just didn't understand. "I take that to mean that you aren't entirely adverse to the idea," Harry said, leaning against the man. Sirius had given them some odd looks, some terrified looks, but when after the first week neither of them had made any move to hurt him, he'd relaxed. "Well, I hadn't thought about having children quite so soon," the man teased. Harry snorted and pressed a key to the firm shoulder. He'd missed the Dark Lord terribly. Their visits were infrequent and short at best. Harry had hopes for tonight though. It was a Friday, surely Dark Lords must get the weekend off. "I think I have a hard time viewing him as your son actually," the Dark Lord said eventually. "More like another apprentice, only not as close to you as Severus is," he said, setting his cup to the side so that he could wrap Harry into his arms. Speaking of which, how is Severus taking it? He said casually. Harry shifted closer to the man and smirked slightly. He was livid, of course, kept saying that he hated me and wanted nothing more to do with me, but then Lily talked to him, smacked up upside the head really, and Severus came back to apologize. He's ignoring Sirius now, acts like he isn't there when they're in the same room. Harry said, amused. Perhaps the mudblood isn't entirely useless. The Dark Lord muttered comfortably. Harry snorted. Leave the poor girl alone, she's done nothing to you, Harry said, pinching the man's nipple in retaliation. The Dark Lord's eyes darkened and he leaned closer still, his breath ghosting across Harry's jaw making him shiver. I'm being more than accommodating to you, my consort. Now get rid of the stray cat you've picked up, my patience wears thin. He said, his voice low and dangerous. Harry shuddered. He loved when the man made threats like that, it usually promised for a very fulfilling night. Sirius, it's nearly curfew, Harry said, slipping from where he sat so that he could cross the room. Gray eyes narrowed and looked at the time. Oh hush, get out of here so I can have a night with my lover, I'll take you to dinner sometime to make up for it, all right? He said, reaching out to drag his fingers through the messy hair. This Sirius was nothing like the man Harry had met. That summer had changed him in more than one way. Sirius winced slightly at the thought before gathering his books up and slipping them into his bag. Do you need dreamless sleep? Harry asked, running his scan over the youth thoughtlessly. Sirius. Lips twitched upwards and he shook his head slightly, but Harry wasn't fooled. The boy was as proud as Remus when it came to accepting help. He pulled one out and handed it to the boy. Just in case, he said with a wink before dragging the boy out of his rooms. Sirius rolled his eyes and swatted Harry's hands away before making his way down the hall, waving absently behind him. Harry closed the door and frowned. You're worried about him, the Dark Lord said, coming up behind him and wrapping him in his arms. He hasn't spoken a word, Harry said, tilting his head to the side as lips caressed the skin there, making him burn. Hush, worry about him tomorrow, think only of me tonight, the man urged, drawing him backwards. Harry smiled and allowed himself to relax into the man's embrace as lips trailed his shoulders. Harry gasped when the man pressed his wand to his back and the sound of fabric tearing echoed through his rooms, making him shiver as his robes pulled uselessly around his feet. A talented mouth settled on his shoulder like a brand and the large hands lit around him, touching and teasing possessively over his chilled skin. Yes, Harry whispered when the hand wrapped around his length and slowly rubbed. Odd. I expect so much of so many people, Harry gasped as he was released and spun around, his back pressed to the door as the man loomed over him. But not you, my consort, he said, lifting his hand and cradling his jaw. You make me want to go to great lengths just to please you, he whispered, lifting Harry's arms and pinning his wrists above his head. Harry gazed at the man, simply taking in the now familiar face that he'd become so familiar with. And you, Harry breathed as their lips hovered apart, teasing, brushing but never keying. I wanted to hate you, I thought I could back out at any time, yet here I am, he admitted softly, and I can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else, he breathed, leaning forward to catch a key. The Dark Lord growled low in his throat before pressing their bodies together, his larger one overwhelming and bold, making Harry shiver and shake with want. You won't be anywhere else, my pet, not ever, I won't allow it. Harry sighed as hands moved and settled around his waist, lifting him effortlessly. None of this, pet, I want you on a bed properly, he whispered as Harry wrapped his legs around the man and let out a soft groan of protest. Harry wasn't really protesting though, he liked being carried like this and wound his arms around the other man, clinging to him happily. You have a week's work to make up to me, my lord, Harry said softly as they entered his room before he was carefully dropped onto the bed, shivering at the missing warmth when the Dark Lord pulled away and smirked down at him, reaching for the clasps to his robes. Harry's eyes flashed and a wave of magic swept over the man, causing his breath to catch as the clasps released and fell away in an instant. A slow, satisfied smirk curved across Harry's lips and the Dark Lord let out a low chuckle. My, aren't we eager, he said softly. Harry turned and lay on his back, spreading his thighs to reveal himself as prepared and glistening with oil. You have no idea, Harry said, smirking at the dark, nearly black with want. In an instant the Dark Lord was peeling away his clothes and sliding across the bed gloriously naked. Harry groaned loudly when the man settled over him, that strange magic winding around him, making it dizzying to think or do anything but accept the intrusion that happened so quickly he hardly had the chance to breathe. The Dark Lord was inside him, pulsing heat burning from the quick entry and seated to the hilt. Teeth bit into his shoulder deeply and he cried out as the man began to move without regret, without mercy, burning and aching and taking his pleasure while Harry clung to his sanity. His own body was rippling with satisfaction and he hissed when the key of a blade circled his nipple. "Hadrian," the man breathed, making him shudder. "Do it." Harry gasped. The Dark Lord loved this and he could admit that he loved it too. The blade pricked and bit his skin, making thin raw lines that heightened the beauty of their lovemaking and intensified the pleasure that every nerve felt to impossible heights. Harry whined and groaned as teeth and lips and tongue followed the shallow cut, lapping up the blood that welled and leaving a trail of red marks. Harry clung to the man, incapable of doing anything more. His fingers tangled into the mess of hair and he arched his back as he felt the blade key his navel, which was tight in anticipation and need. The Dark Lord cut deeply and suddenly. The pain of it, the shock and the ecstasy made Harry scream as he came shuddering when he felt the man tense up and join him in release. "Hadrian," the Dark Lord breathed, falling across him in a comforting weight. "I'm bleeding all over you," he said, wincing at the slight burn. He loved it during but the after part was not very nice. "I don't mind," the man said, smirking against his neck. Harry wrinkled his nose. "It hurts. Get off so I can fix it," he said, pinching the man's arm. The Dark Lord sighed and rolled off, watching Harry as he summoned his wand and carefully closed the wounds. Harry sighed happily as he cast a cleaning charm and then turned, pressing himself into the amused man's arms. "And just what do you think you're doing?" he said, pressing keys to Harry's shoulders. "Cuddling," Harry said without remorse. The Dark Lord snorted and bit down gently on his shoulder. "Who says I'm done with you already?" he said lightly. Harry grinned. "Oh, I know you aren't. If you were, I'd worry that you were sleeping with someone else. But either way, you and I need some recovery time. We're old men, you know." Harry teased lightly. "I would never betray you that way," the man said, pressing a key to his forehead. "And I am not old," he said as an afterthought. Harry grinned. "Prove it," he challenged, gazing up at the man with burning eyes. The Dark Lord smirked. "Who am I to refuse my consort?" he said before rolling them over. Harry sighed. So this was what happiness felt like. Harry groaned as the Dark Lord sat up. "Stone isn't in Hogwarts. Come back to bed," he said, pouting. "How do you know?" the man said, quirking an eyebrow. "I don't, but I want you here with me," Harry said petulantly. The Dark Lord snorted and tweaked his nose playfully before pressing a key to his scowling lips and standing. He gave Harry a magnificent view of his ass as he was getting dressed, so Harry didn't really complain. "Don't get caught, my lord," Harry said before rolling over. He could feel the man smile and nearly jumped when the blanket lifted and tugged, pulling up around him so that he was buried in it, just his head peeking out. "I'll be back before dawn," the man said, pressing a key to his temple. "You'd better. I want breakfast and your cock is on the menu," Harry said, sending the man a tired but heated look. The Dark Lord grinned evilly. "As you wish, my pet," he said as he pulled his cloak around his shoulders and slipped from the room. Harry sighed and tried to fall back asleep. His body was thrumming pleasantly and achy in all the right places. He was sure that should he look in a mirror he was likely to find himself marked in very many ways. Letting out a tired sigh of contentment, he fell into a light slumber, waiting for the Dark Lord to return. Harry grinned as he woke to find himself surrounded by his lover. Is that breakfast I smell?" he said, sliding down the tall form. "Greedy little thing, you'd think that after last night you would have had enough," the Dark Lord said, his voice rough with sleep. "I could never have enough of you," Harry said, his breath ghosting over the tip of the man's steadily rising interest. "Knock, knock, knock," the Dark Lord hissed violently, and Harry sighed before slowly sliding off the bed and sending the man a regretful look as he pulled his dress robe on and cast a few glamours at the bruising around his neck and collar bones. "Knock, knock, knock, coming," Harry said in annoyance as he pulled open the door. "This had better be good, headmaster," he said, staring blearily at the man's violet robes. "I was about to have breakfast," he said, yawning. The headmaster narrowed his eyes a bit and smiled thinly. "I see," he said too knowingly. However, I'm afraid I must ask you to eat in haste. There's been an accident, I'm afraid. Professor Grubby Plank was supposed to chaperone today, but while feeding the griffins yesterday it seems he somehow offended one of them. I wouldn't bother you if this wasn't an emergency, he added pointedly. Harry sighed. He had so been looking forward to a lazy morning with his lover. He nearly jumped when familiar hands settled on his shoulders. Oh, do let's go, Hadrian. It's been so long since I've gone on a Hogsmeade weekend. The man purred, pressing a key to the top of his head in silent apology. Tom, the headmaster said grimly. I prefer Lord Gaunt, the Dark Lord said silkily. Won't you come in, headmaster? Harry said dryly. Since my efforts at discretion are wasted, he said, rolling his eyes as he bumped Riddle back into his rooms. Honestly, what if one of the students saw? Harry scolded appropriately as he guided them into his living room and called for tea. Hadrian. The Dark Lord's voice was serious and Harry frowned at it. Go to Hogsmeade with me, the man said, his lips twitching. Harry rolled his eyes. Very well, I might as well get a date out of the situation, he said, smirking. Would you like flowers? The Dark Lord offered. Harry snorted. I will curse you, he warned. The Dark Lord smirked and tugged him closer, pressing a key to his temple. Chocolates then, the man offered. No tricks, and I mean it, Harry said mildly. A real date, no tricks, the man said with a nod. Harry gazed at him skeptically. Fine, he said before handing the man his tea and pouring another cup for himself. I was unaware that you were currently seeing anyone, Hadrian, the headmaster said with a frown. There are strict rules in regards to professors entering into relationships, he said, his voice almost chiding. The Dark Lord smirked over the rim of his cup. I assure you, headmaster, despite our affectionate ways, I am courting Hadrian properly and openly. In fact, his first gift from me is due, he said slyly before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small jewelry box. I had been waiting for the appropriate time to give this to you last night, however we were rather distracted, he said this time to Harry, who accepted the box suspiciously. He pulled out his wand and checked it for curses or wards, causing the Dark Lord to snort in mild amusement. Harry smirked at the man teasingly before carefully opening the box. His breath caught in his throat and his heart seized in his chest. I will never betray you, Harry read as he pulled out the elegant ring and stared up at the Dark Lord in shock. I don't want to bring up bad memories, Hadrian, but I needed to do this for you. I will not betray you the way Elizabeth did. I know you find that hard to believe right now, but I will say it as many times as you need me to, he said, reaching out and grasping Harry's hand, slipping the ring on. A promise ring, the headmaster said softly, his eyebrows soaring into his hairline. I know you don't think well of me, headmaster, but you of all people should know that when I put my mind to something there is nothing that can stop me. Hadrian is mine and he will always be mine. Touch him and I will come after you with a fury that would make angels weep, he swore, snatching Harry's hand into his. Harry stared at him in shock. What was this? What were they? What was the man offering to him? His eyes dropped down to the ring and he stared at it, confused and unable to understand. He shook his head. I need to get dressed, he said, pulling his hand back and nearly running from the room. He rushed to the bathroom and closed the door behind him, leaning over the sink to dry heave. He was shaking as he stared at his reflection, his eyes trailing to where his robe separated, showing the many marks the Dark Lord had left on him. They were good together, so good, too good. Hadrian. The Dark Lord undid his wards easily and Harry felt tears in his eyes when he looked up at the worried gaze. I'm sorry, he whispered. It's beautiful, it really is, but, he was shaking and the tears came even as he cursed them. You're afraid. I can feel your fear, the man said, his gaze carefully blank. Harry knew why. To be honest, he had known for days now. How else did one explain away the longing he felt? How else could he explain how often he thought of the man, how he found himself wondering what the man would like to eat or drink, or remembering his favorite things? It was terrifying because he had all that he could possibly want within his reach. I've felt this way before, Harry breathed. So very close, so happy, and then, he stared down at the ring. I will not betray you. Say it, the man said, his eyes suddenly wide, suddenly wanting. As Harry looked at them he could see his own fears reflected in them. If I do, it will be real. If I do, you could break me, everything will change. No, the man said firmly. But this was the Dark Lord. The man who had destroyed his younger years. But this wasn't that man. This was a man who was trying, going beyond his own doubts and fears to face Harry. This was the man that knew nothing of the prophecy and his part in it. Please. Harry wondered if the Dark Lord was conscious of slipping into Parseltongue. Harry knew though in that exact moment, that he would fight for this for them. He would face fate if he had to. I love you, he breathed helplessly. That was it. The Dark Lord would laugh at him, he would cackle that high-pitched cackle. He would try to kill Harry. Would parade him around in the streets. Mine. The Dark Lord said quietly before suddenly swooping forward and claiming his lips. Mine, I will come to love you, give me time my pet, my consort. I will have you and I will have the world. Harry was trembling as those words were whispered across his lips. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to think. Should he tell the man he could understand him? But then how could he explain it? Lips brushed his gently this time and Harry found himself seeking out the touch, leaning into the man almost desperately. What was he to do now? All this time he'd been so firm in his convictions, never love, that was his rule, he had to abide by this or he was left open and raw. But the Dark Lord had sworn not to betray him. The Dark Lord, the man who seemed to hold him perfectly, who challenged him and made him burn. His Lord. Slowly the Dark Lord eased back, his eyes burning as they watched him. We should get dressed, he said, brushing Harry's bottom lip with his thumb. Harry nodded thoughtlessly and breathed slowly, his breathing shaky as he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to the man's chest. Please, please don't hurt me, he begged. I swore not to, the man said softly. Harry shivered. You aren't the first person to make promises to me. I only hope that you're one of the rare few that doesn't break those promises. Harry said softly. What can I do? You make me want to trust you. At least I know that you aren't about to tell me you're married to a Crouch. He said wryly before shaking his head. We need to get dressed, he said, looking up. But that was his mistake, because when he did, all he could see was the man who stood before him, the man who overwhelmed him and comforted him, the one who felt like safety, the one he loved. Gentle fingers brushed his cheek. It's the oddest feeling. I can't feel your heart, I can feel your love, he said, watching Harry in awe. Then be assured of it, Harry said, smiling faintly. Even if I have my doubts, there is no changing what I feel for you now. A part of me screams at me that I should have kept it hidden, kept it a secret, but you knew already, didn't you? He said, shaking his head as his eyes were drawn to the ring where the emeralds glittered beautifully. I am your consort. My loyalty belongs to you, he said softly before dropping his hand and slipping around the man. They dressed in silence, their earlier playfulness broken by their thoughts and the change between them. It wasn't going to be just say anymore, it wasn't political games or social dances, they were through teasing and toying with each other. Of course Harry suspected they would always torment each other, it was too tempting not to, too much a part of who they were, but there was something behind it now, some assurance that hadn't been there before. It loomed over his shoulder and Harry couldn't help but glance back at it, partly to make sure that it was there and partly out of fear of it. You can stop glancing over your shoulder every 5 seconds, the Dark Lord said thinly as they entered Honeydukes. Harry frowned, he really hadn't noticed that he was doing it. Sorry, he said, forcing his gaze to remain forward. What the Duce has you so nervous? I can feel it buzzing around in the back of my head. For Merlin's sake, it's just chocolate, the man said, his patience having run out. They'd been dealing with students all morning and Harry was nearly certain the outing had made the man reconsider his previous wish to become a professor. Every date I've ever been on in Hogsmeade has ended in disaster, Harry admitted with a huff. The Dark Lord stared at him for a long moment. That is positively ridiculous, he said, shaking his head. Harry snorted. Tell that to Cho Chang or Elizabeth, or any of the other girls he'd brought to Hogsmeade. Really? Wait, he grinned slightly. You're right. The only dates I ever brought to Hogsmeade were girls, he said smugly. The Dark Lord quirked an eyebrow at him before shaking his head. The mystery of your continues to elude me, he said, picking up a bar of chocolate to look more closely at the label. HN, and you do spend a great deal of time studying my... Harry murmured, his lips twitching upwards. The man's foul mood dissipated at this and he tossed the bar into a bag. And it will be studied even more in depth later, After all, what would a man like myself want with all this chocolate? He said silkily, causing Harry to look down at the small pile he'd unwittingly been carrying. Heat curled through him and he leaned closer to the man, enjoying being close to him. "Ah, look, your apprentice and his mudblood," the Dark Lord said, smirking. Harry frowned and looked up through the window, his eyes catching sight of Severus. A chill crept up his spine as he watched the young man laughing, so much joy in his eyes as he was dragged through the crowds by an excited Lily. Harry had a bad feeling, a very bad feeling, but he couldn't quite place it. The blood rushed from his face and he swayed, feeling suddenly faint. "My lord, I don't feel very well," he muttered through a sea of confusion. "Hadrian," and then he was out. The Dark Lord had never been more terrified in his life than he was the moment Hadrian collapsed beside him. The young face had gone slack and pale, normally glittering green eyes dampened and dull, his body like that of a puppet whose strings had been cut. What's worse was that when he reached to grasp his lover he could feel no pulse, nothing at all. For a brief terrifying moment he'd thought that Hadrian was dead somehow. He should have listened to his lover. Hadrian's instincts were nearly always right, he simply had a way of knowing things. Voldemort sat helplessly beside the bed, wishing for the first time in his life that he knew more about healing than about inflicting pain. "I take it that Hadrian has never told you what he is?" Dumbledore, ever meddlesome, ever sly, crept up on him in his most desperate moment. He knew he should ignore the man, but Hadrian was lying on the bed as white as the sheets he was wrapped in, with no sign of waking, and there was nothing he could do. There was nothing he could do. "No," he said dully. The headmaster nodded and slipped around the bed, staring down at his Hadrian with a look of concentration. "He is a time traveler," the man said, dropping the bomb so to speak without regret. "I don't know from what time, however it is a time in the far-reaching future, and in that time he fought a war. A war he had to lead, and a war that I suspect he was losing," the headmaster said, gazing down at Hadrian seriously. "His best friend sent him here, to this time, in hopes that he could find happiness, admirable, but flawed and desperate logic," the man said before carefully seating himself. "I suspect that she based her ideas off one of my own rather ingenious creations, however she couldn't have known the reasons that I never used the device myself," the headmaster said softly. "The machine is too great a risk and far too dangerous a creation." "What is wrong with him?" the Dark Lord demanded coldly. He didn't care where Hadrian come from. The boy could be a demon from hell for all he cared. Hadrian was his consort, and his consort was dying, right there in front of him. He could feel it. "He's become a fixed point in time, I suspect," the headmaster said gravely. "He is timeless, ageless, and soon there will be nothing that can hurt him for very long. What we are witnessing right now is a metamorphosis. His body is changing on a molecular level to become what it needs to become in order to stay in this time. Then once it is stable he will undoubtedly have to wait. I can guess that he may age just as slowly as he's been aging before the cycle stops and he is frozen as he is." "You're speaking in riddles," the Dark Lord hissed furiously. "He is a paradox, Tom. He is becoming something that will not change, will not age," the headmaster said sharply. "He has changed and damaged his own fate somehow, and now time is making up for it the only way it knows how. It's freezing him. He will be that one thing that will remain in existence as he is now, unchanging, without age or law. I suspect that had he not been bound to you in this time, he would be like a blip in time, appearing here and there without reason or rhyme," he said, pointing out their joined hands where the tattoo glowed gently. "Your bond is grounding him, keeping him here, but it won't be without consequence, and it may not even be as permanent as we would like. Something has started. Something has triggered this change in him, and I cannot even begin to think of what that change might be," the man said forcefully. "Run a scan over him, Tom. You'll understand what I mean," the headmaster said tiredly when the Dark Lord continued to stare at him accusingly. The Dark Lord lifted his wand. "There's no need," a quiet voice spoke up, startling both of them. Severus Snape stepped into the room, his gaze serious as it turned to the headmaster. "I knew you would be the one to betray him in the end, headmaster. I just didn't want to believe it," he said, clutching an enormous file in his arms before hesitantly handing it to the Dark Lord. "Hadrian let me perform the spells on him under the guise of learning. He hasn't been to see a proper healer in all of his life. he said, watching as the Dark Lord snatched the folder and hungrily began to scan the documents. This can't be right, the man said after a moment. The tests are accurate. Hadrian's body is changing constantly. It's been changing slowly over the years, but lately the speed of the change has increased. Look, Severus said, pointing to one parchment in particular. This is a scan I performed to check his bones for abnormalities. Malnutrition. And these 46 broken bones, 17 fractures, those are a list of injuries his body has sustained. He said, pointing to the pile of parchment behind the one. Hadrian is going to be in pain because his body is erasing all his past injuries, every concussion, every cut, every bullet wound. He will suffer them again so that his body can erase them. That's what is happening now. I've been keeping an eye on him, but I didn't know who I should go to. Hadrian, he is everything to my mother and I couldn't just give this information to anyone. He said, shaking his head. So you chose the Dark Lord? The headmaster said in disappointment. You can't even take care of the students under your charge, headmaster. How was I supposed to be able to trust you? Severus said with a lift of his chin. The headmaster's shoulders sagged slightly. You gave away Hadrian's most guarded secret. Don't you think he wants to forget that past? He was beaten and starved. His friends died before his eyes one by one. That past is something that he should forget if he wants to move on. The youth said with a lift of his chin. Lord Gaunt, he can take care of Hadrian better than I can. He can be there in ways that my mother and I just can't, and he's proven to us at least that if there is anyone in this world who deserves to stand by Hadrian, it's him, the man who can make Hadrian smile. Severus said with glittering eyes. What you're telling me, what you're both telling me, is that Hadrian is immortal. The Dark Lord said quietly. It isn't a gift, Tom, it's a curse. The headmaster hissed. He will be forever this way. Everyone he knows will grow old and fade away. This from the man who has created a philosopher's stone. The Dark Lord said, clutching the parchments in his hand. The headmaster paled considerably. How did you know that? Only myself and Nicholas Flamel are aware of it. The man said with wide eyes. It isn't such a secret, old man. The Dark Lord said coldly. I will take care of Hadrian. I will protect my consort. He growled, his eyes flashing. The headmaster stumbled back. Consort. He breathed wide-eyed. The Dark Lord held up their wrists. What did you think this bond was? This is no mere brand, headmaster. I have made him mine, and I'll be damned if I let anything take him from me. The Dark Lord growled. I will bond with him, and then I will seek out immortality for myself. Hadrian will not be alone in his pain. He swore furiously before turning to Severus as he seated himself. Tell me everything that you know, he demanded. The headmaster had the strangest feeling as he stared at the Dark Lord. An icy breeze slipped through the infirmary and he stumbled back, wondering what was in store for the world with these two men in power. Harry was wandering, lost on the battlefield, surrounded by blood and twisted bodies. Harry, he jumped and turned, his heart squeezing as he caught sight of Hermione. She was just as he'd remembered, cold, shrewd eyes, shorn hair, dirty, torn clothes that she'd lost the will to care for, and beautiful. He'd always thought so. My own, he asked softly. Harry, I don't have much time. I don't know what you did, I really don't, but whatever it was, thank you. She said, her face melting a bit. People are forgetting, like the war never happened. I think I'm the only one left that remembers, but it won't be for long. I created a way of contacting you, and I don't even know if it will work. She said, tears coming to her eyes. The world is changing. Little things at first, but then bigger things. London is as it was before this all began, the ministry fixed and running as if nothing happened. You impossible man, you weren't supposed to change fate so completely. She said with a smile. But then that's always been you, hasn't it, Harry? Doing impossible things. She choked off and looked away. The children are alive, Harry. All the ones that we lost, alive and with their families. None of it ever happened, and no one knows anything about a Harry Potter. Harry, you don't exist in my world, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you, Harry, and Ron would send his love if he could remember you. He's quite changed, you see, and soon I will be too. She glanced back and an expression of anticipation crossed her face before she turned back to Harry. Thank you, Harry. Whatever you did, thank you. I love you, Harry. Please be happy. That's all I want for you. Goodbye. She ended, a tear slipping down her cheek. Harry gasped and reached out when her figure, which had appeared as corporal as his own, began to fade. Hermione smiled gently at him before in an instant she was gone and Harry was left alone in the dark. His world, gone. It might have seemed selfish, but he grew angry at its loss. All the sacrifice, all the pain, all for nothing. They didn't even have a boy named Harry Potter, she'd said. Harry bent down and curled his arms around his legs. Ron was alive, and Hermione, they were living in a safer world. They were untouched by the darkness he'd lived through. He could imagine just for a moment the innocence he'd once known in Hermione, before pain had hardened her and taken her smile from her. He remembered the girl whose only worries were that people thought she had big teeth. Harry let out a short laugh as he remembered the good times. Those memories had been too painful to relive up until now, but now trapped in a seemingly never-ending darkness he could remember them. Ron and the quirky faces he made when Hermione said something he didn't understand. Hermione and the sharp curiosity that knew no bounds. His first Christmas gifts. And the memories went on. The little things that at the time had seemed so unimportant, the times they'd laughed, argued, cried. The trouble they'd gotten into on a nearly constant basis, all of it was gone. They were gone, but as he thought of them he realized that they weren't really, they were still there sitting in a corner in his heart. Hadrian. Harry looked up at the sound of the familiar voice. His wrist tingled and then ached as though he was being pulled by some invisible string. His scar burned and seared. Harry stood cautiously and lifted his arm following the pull. Yes, my consort. Harry frowned. Consort? Whose consort? Red eyes. Thin smile. Gasp. Passion. I love you. Hadrian. 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 Wake up. Harry gasped as the voice echoed in his mind. His heart was hammering as he panted, looking around him startled and terrified. Red eyes. Hadrian. The Dark Lord croaked. Harry stared at the man, the beautiful man who was sitting at his bedside surrounded by books and clutching his hand tightly. Harry relaxed slowly. What happened? Harry said, wincing as a sharp pain went through his skull. You're bleeding, the man said with a frown, completely ignoring the books that fell from his lap as he stood and reached forward, brushing his fringe aside. I'll be fine, my lord, Harry said, startled by the sudden closeness. The man's face became pinched and his eyes darkened. You've been unconscious for a week, Hadrian, fading in and out of existence. I doubt you are fine, he said coldly. Harry stared up at the man in shock, noting for the first time the deep circles under the man's eyes and the way he was clutching his hand in a vice grip. Why? Harry said, startled. The headmaster seems to think that it has something to do with you being a time traveler, the man said silkily. Oh, Harry nodded before stilling. Oh, exactly when were you going to tell me that you were a time traveler? The man said softly. Harry's mind scrambled for an answer, though his automatic response was to go on the defense. Exactly when were you going to tell me that you're actually a half-blood? Harry said in the same tone. The man's face pinched and his eyes narrowed, causing him to wince. I don't care, you know. My real mother was a Muggle. I was blood adopted by the Black family, so I was able to fool the tests, he said, biting his lip. The Dark Lord let out a long sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. I'd forgotten how frustrating you could be, he said, though his lips were twitching upwards. Harry smiled faintly. I didn't mean to worry you, he said, ducking his head. The man sighed again. I wasn't worried, the man denied. Of course you weren't, you just decided to spend the last week wearing the same pair of robes you were wearing when we were on our date and surround yourself with books at my bedside, all of which I might add are relative to time travel, he said smugly. How is it that you are this coherent? The man said with a sneer. Harry smirked. Thank you, Harry said softly, his form relaxing visibly. For staying, he added, looking away with a light blush staining his cheeks. And for bringing me back, he said, smiling slightly. The man was silent for a long moment before leaning forward and pressing a chaste key to his lips. For once the key remained chaste despite the burn that rushed through them both, and the man pulled back before they could be tempted for more. The headmaster is looking into this as well, he said, pulling back and seating himself elegantly. He believes that you changed something vital in history, something that affected the very way that the world would turn out, he said, his gaze serious. Harry nodded. The future has been rewritten. My best friend visited me while I was unconscious, or at least I think she did. It felt more like something she'd recorded. She said that everything was different, that everyone had forgotten about the war and that I didn't exist in the future. Harry said, his gaze dimming. The hand clutching his squeezed lightly. You've become a fixed point in time. The man said softly. Or you are becoming a fixed point in time, hence the fading in and out of existence. Technically you were never born, however you exist. The world can't simply erase you now that you have your own place in this time, so it's frozen you. You will not die, the Dark Lord said quietly. Harry felt his heart freeze in terror. Will not die. No, he breathed softly. He looked up at the man with wide, terrified eyes. He could remember staring into the graves of his friends and comrades in arms. He could remember wondering when it would be his turn. He was just waiting for it to end, waiting for his grave to be filled so that he could finally be done with the world. Hadrian, the Dark Lord said sharply. Harry was gasping for air. No. I can't, I have to die. I must die. I have to be buried, my God, haven't I done enough? He was babbling and he knew it. Warm lips pressed against his. Fire raced through him and his panic subsided, overwhelmed by the mere presence of his lover. Hadrian, you will not be alone. I will be immortal. I will stay by your side. Something hard and warm pressed into his palm. Harry recognized the feel of it, the flat, smooth like glass. He turned his head towards it in shock and silence, staring into the ruby red that glinted up at him like a familiar friend, the Philosopher's Stone. The Dark Lord would stay with him. He would not be alone. Harry shivered. Hold me, he begged softly. Immediately arms surrounded him with warmth and safety. He wanted to die. That's all he'd been waiting for. But now he had something to live for, didn't he? He sank into the firm arms, the strength that he could rely on. Immortal. Tears dripped down his cheeks. The perfect punishment for challenging fate. Harry sighed as he shifted impatiently, allowing the wand to press against his side and his chest and his arms and legs, prodding and poking despite his discomfort. Across from him Severus and Sirius, unlikely pair that they wore identical smirks of amusement as Harry twitched restlessly. Stay still, the Dark Lord demanded irately. Just you wait. One day you'll catch the flu, my lord, and when you do, Harry said through grit teeth. The Dark Lord's lips twitched. The wizard's flu vaccination was created 5 years ago. No one gets the flu anymore. The man pointed out. Be still, he said, swatting Harry's behind as he fidgeted. Harry grumbled furiously under his breath. He has to make sure you're healthy. We don't know what might happen to you when your body keeps changing so rapidly. Severus pointed out logically. Harry sneered and grit his teeth. It was true. He'd seen the results from last few scans. His body was doing weird things. I feel fine, Harry said stiffly. I caught you eating tuna out of a can covered in chocolate syrup. Severus said blandly. That's disgusting, Sirius said softly, his nose wrinkling. The young man had gained his voice back in the time that Harry was unconscious, however he was still soft-spoken and gravitated towards James, Remus or Hadrian. He still had the shakes sometimes, but Harry knew from experience that it was normal for someone who had been under the Cruciatus curse as many times as he had. I know I have to key the man, the Dark Lord said wryly. Harry scowled. It was a weird craving. I didn't even notice that I was eating it until Severus pointed it out. Harry said in his defense. And your hair, how do you explain waking up cocooned in hair? The Dark Lord said, amused. Harry huffed and winced as he was prodded in the back. Maybe I got cold. It wouldn't be the first time my hair grew in the middle of the night. Harry said in his defense. Yes, it probably happened when you were a child, when your magic was constantly in flux the way it is right now. The Dark Lord said logically. Harry was beginning to hate logic. But physically I'm healthy, in peak shape, that's what the nurse said. He protested. She also said that you had more hormones running through you than a pregnant woman. Severus pointed out dryly. Harry grew very annoyed, his temper rising. He swatted away the wand and jumped from the stool. Get that thing away from me, I swear, if I have to be poked one more time. Severus and Sirius exchanged amused glances and the Dark Lord quirked an eyebrow. Why are you all looking at me like that? Harry said, his heart sinking, falling, crashing, breaking. I'm not crazy, he protested as tears gathered in his eyes. The Dark Lord sighed. And this is the very reason I refused to take a wife. I thought to myself that I would be quite safe taking a male as my consort, no tears, no emotional messes, but no, I happen to find the one male who makes absolutely no sense. The man said, his patience wearing thin. Harry sniffled, but the tears kept coming and he couldn't wipe them away. Wrong thing to say, Sirius said with a knowing nod as Harry began to weep in earnest. Mr. Black. Harry took one look at Lily and let out a whimper, dropping down to a crouch and wrapping his arms around his legs. Hormones. The three men said in unison. For shame, all of you. Lily snapped, her fiery temper coming to the forefront as she crouched down beside Harry and wrapped her arms around him. He was only reminded though that his own mother never knew him in his time, no one knew him. Oh, Hadrian, Lily said softly. I wanna die. Harry wept bitterly. No one knows me. My mother, my father, gone, all gone. My friends never knew me, my godfather, he choked. I was better off never being born, that's what fate wants me to know. Without me there was no terror, no people dying every day, no mothers weeping over graves. My God, I didn't know what to say to them, how to tell them that their children died in vain. But it's all gone now, so it doesn't really matter. I'm the only one that remembers, I'm the only one that can remember. And I can't bloody die. Why didn't I just let them shoot me? Why did I keep going? There was so much blood, all of it innocent. I could have died and nothing would have mattered anymore. A snarl broke his ramblings off and he was suddenly hauled to his feet by his hair, the Dark Lord's hand yanking his head back while the other arm came around him. Lord Gaunt, Lily said aghast. No more talk of dying. What is done is done. You will live here beside me and I will do whatever it takes to make you happy, but you will not leave me for death. You are mine. The man growled furiously. It hurt. Harry was nearly sure that some of his hair had been yanked out, but despite the pain he felt oddly better. Please, he whispered, leaning closer. The Dark Lord let out an annoyed sound before yanking him close, pulling him tightly to his chest. You foolish creature, what am I to do with you? You drive me mad, he ground out. Harry sighed and relaxed in the man's arms. The panic washed away and he was soothed and cajoled simply by being so close to the man. Your bond is what is stabilizing him in this time. The closer he is to you and the more often that you touch, the better. Severus said, scribbling something down in his notebook. Severus was completely nonplussed by all of this. He was used to the two of them. He'd taken it upon himself to log all the changes Harry faced. Every outburst was written down in great detail, making him feel like a lab rat. Boys, Lily huffed in frustration before rounding on Severus. Would you treat me like that if I was pregnant and hormonal? She demanded. Harry grinned evilly and twisted to see Severus' face redden, his eyes glazing over. Severus stuttered. Harry shared an evil grin with Sirius. I would treat you like the queen you are. Harry stage whispered. Severus' face turned impossibly red and he buried his face in his hands, causing Lily to grin in triumph despite the blush on her cheeks. Well, Severus, she demanded, tapping her foot impatiently. I would treat you like the queen that you are. Severus muttered into his hands, completely mortified. Sirius let out a low whistle. Man, you are whipped, he said sadly. Oi, no teasing my apprentice or I'll make sure you get yours when you finally fall in love. Harry said shortly. Severus groaned and Lily blushed brightly. Not me, man, single for life. Sirius said, shaking his head. That's what we all say at some point. Harry said dryly. The Dark Lord snorted and pressed a key to the top of his head. Feeling better, I see, the man said tightly. Harry glanced up at the man and flushed. Sorry, he said, shifting uneasily. The Dark Lord twitched. You will make this up to me later, he said knowingly. Harry smirked and his eyes heated. Oh yes, he agreed. Oh God, it's like watching your parents have say. Sirius said, looking queasy. You watched your parents have say? How naughty of you, Harry said, quirking his eyebrow at the boy, making him blanch and shudder. That's just wrong, so wrong, he said, shivering again. Harry snorted only to glare as the Dark Lord lifted him and settled him back onto the stool. Be still, pet, I'll make it worth your while, the Dark Lord said, smirking. Harry narrowed his eyes at the man. You'll give me back my bathrobe, he said, bargaining. The Dark Lord's nose wrinkled. That horrid fluffy thing with the pockets. Certainly not, he said snidely. I liked that robe, Harry said, frowning. I use that robe when I'm studying, he said, crossing his arms. And now the house elves use scraps of it to clean with. The Dark Lord mused. You horrid, horrid man. Harry accused. I make up for it in bed. The man said unrepentantly. You two fight like an old married couple. Sirius said amused. Hush, Harry and the Dark Lord said in unison. Lily let out a giggle. Harry scowled as he was viscously prodded with the man's wand. I remember when I was single, Harry beeped. Knew beautiful men and women every night. He sighed wistfully. Thank you my lord for making him an honest man, I can't tell you how many pures you saved. Severus said cheekily. Severus, Lily said blushing. She's right Severus, not in front of the lady. The Dark Lord said lightly though there was a thin smile on his lips. What? No jealous outburst. Harry said shocked. I'm biding my time before I work my way through your past lovers and kill them all. The man said smoothly. Don't bother my lord. He hasn't looked at another person since meeting you, truly shocking at first considering how often his eyes wandered before. Severus drawled. I used to do that just to make you blush Severus, do you remember our first trip to Diagon Alley? Harry said fondly before letting out an alarmed sound when the Dark Lord suddenly pulled him into his arms. What happened in Diagon Alley he demanded silkily though there was a dangerous edge to his voice. He flirted with everything that moved even the goblin at Gringotts. Severus said dryly. Severus could hardly sting a sentence together the whole day he was stuttering so much. Harry said smirking. You little tease, a goblin really. The Dark Lord said pulling Harry close to his chest and winding his arms around him so that Harry was completely surrounded. It was not well received. Severus said rolling his eyes. He hissed at me, Harry said with a frown. And fined me 10 gallons. He added wrinkling his nose. Clever goblin. The Dark Lord said pressing a key to the top of his head. Mine, he said with an edge to his voice that made Harry wonder if he hadn't perhaps pushed a little too far. Yours. Harry agreed nuzzling the man's arm since it was the only thing he could reach as bound as he was by the strong hold. Erg, Sirius said wrinkling his nose. I think it's sweet, Lily defended. Harry smirked and glanced up at Severus who twitched at the pointed look he was receiving. There would be hell to pay if he didn't do it and he knew it. With a sigh Severus reached out and pulled Lily into his arms brushing a key to her cheek. Yours, he said quietly causing her to turn bright red. Good apprentice. Harry cheered. I think I'm gonna be sick. Sirius said sneering. I am so going to torment you when you fall in love, Harry said evilly. Hadrian is endearing as this childish side of you as you have classes to teach in a few moments. The Dark Lord said softly. Harry sighed. Fine, fine, bunch of idiots that don't know the difference between a stirring rod and a wand don't ever become a Professor Severus. He warned blithely. Duly noted. Severus said amused. I don't suppose I'll be seeing you later. Harry said turning to the Dark Lord with wide green eyes. You know that look doesn't work on me. The Dark Lord drawled with a sneer. Harry frowned. What about this one? He said in his deepest voice as he tilted his chin down and gazed up at the man, heat and submission in his eyes. That works. The man said tightly, his grip around Harry tightening. Harry gasped softly as he felt the man harden behind him. Then be here tonight, my lord. Harry said softly. That's it, I'm leaving, Severus said wrinkling his nose. I don't know, I almost want to stay and watch the show, Sirius said, a bit of humor in his voice. Not if you value your life, Black. The Dark Lord said seriously. Right, going to class now. Sirius agreed before scurrying out of the room with Lily and Severus in tow. Harry snorted. Must you scare the children? Harry asked as a hand reached up and guided his head to the side so that the man could key his neck. I have half a mind to bend you over right here, my consort. The Dark Lord warned. Harry gasped as the hot mouth latched onto his neck and bit down harshly before beeping and laving the abused flesh. I have half a mind to let you. Harry panted, a shudder sliding through him. Which is why I'm in control. The Dark Lord said, pressing a key to his neck before pulling away. I will be back sometime tonight, though I may stop and speak to the headmaster. He said, a hint of annoyance in his voice. Speak to the headmaster? Harry asked, stepping closer even as the man backed towards the doors to the infirmary. I thought you abhorred the mere idea of being in the same room with the man. He said, scowling when the Dark Lord evaded him. they hadn't had say since he'd been in a coma and it was killing him. Oh, I do, however he has a brilliant mind, I cannot ignore that. He said, dropping a key to Harry's lips before capturing his hand and settling it in the crook of his elbow as they stepped into the hall. Harry sighed and resigned himself to waiting. Should I be worried? The two most brilliant minds in the world working together, there should be some cosmic law to that. He said, shaking his head. There probably is, though you shouldn't be talking, oh great paradox, child. Harry halted and stared up at the man with a horrified expression. Seriously, that's what you're calling me? He said, a sick feeling in his stomach. Dumbledore's idea, I assure you. He didn't like any of the names I chose. The man said with an amused smirk. Harry felt some of the ill feeling pass at this. Oh, and what sort of names would those be? He said slyly as they passed a gaggle of students. Not ones that I can repeat in public. The man said, his voice deepening just the slightest bit. Harry felt warmth rise in his chest as he leaned into the man's side. I'm sorry I'm such a mess. Harry said suddenly. I'm working on a potion to balance my hormones, but it's a tricky bit of work. He added. I know I peeked into your notes. The man said, smirking slightly. My notes are warded, Harry said in mild shock. Very well warded, the man agreed. Harry snorted. You have no respect for personal boundaries, do you? He said wryly. I do in fact, however you are my consort and I see you as an extension of myself, meaning that the notes are in their own way, my notes. He reasoned. Harry snorted. Of course, my lord, Harry agreed, rolling his eyes. I do believe you were apologizing. The man pointed out smugly. Oh, I'm quite finished actually, he said nonchalantly. Like hell you are, now say it. The man said, leaning closer, the arm holding his hand flexing, reminding Harry how deliciously capable the man was. These things shouldn't be said all the time, Harry reasoned. It dampens the feeling one gets when they are heard. The Dark Lord halted just before Harry's classroom and turned, looming over him until he was backed into the wall. I shouldn't have to beg you to say them, my consort. The man said softly. Trust me, say them often, I won't ever let their importance fade. He said, lifting Harry's hand and twisting the ring on his finger. Harry stared at it for a moment, his gaze softening. I'll try, he said hesitantly. Oh, the man said pointedly. Harry bit his lip. I love you. He breathed the words almost painful to say. The man's expression softened and he pressed a key to Harry's hand. I would face your hormones every day for the rest of eternity, Hadrian, but only yours. You are the only one that can inspire this patience in me. He said, a hint of dry humor in his voice despite the seriousness of his words. Harry felt that warm spot grow and he darted up, pressing a key to the smooth cheek. I love you, he said again before pulling away and pushing into his classroom, sparing the man a heated stare, his eyes dropping submissively. My lord, he said with heated promise before darting into the room. The Dark Lord stared after his consort and a thought struck him that made his heart ache. His consort, beautiful, vivacious, and his loved him, but what had he given the man? What had he really given him? Promises. He'd trapped the man into this world, trapped him into the place by his side out of pure selfishness, and all he had for the man were more demands. He couldn't help himself though. From the moment he'd heard of the young Hadrian Black all those years ago, he'd been fascinated. He could still remember seeing the man standing on stage looking so much older and wiser and broken than any supposed 15 or 16-year-old should have. At first he'd simply wanted to watch the boy. After all, he'd been traveling, learning, becoming wise. He hadn't any need for a young man like Hadrian except perhaps for a powerful ally when he returned for good. But he'd lost contact with the men who were assigned to watch Hadrian Black. Looking back, that should have been the first tip. Instead he'd lost interest in something so far away, forgot about the young man with old eyes. Until of course he attended the funeral of Lord Sirius Black. His interest had been rekindled, however this time it wouldn't be put out, it was always there in the back of his mind. In Egypt or Africa, in Bangladesh or Cambodia, everywhere he went Hadrian Black's potions were sold. In the potion circle the man had become a legend of sorts, a recluse that no one had met but everyone knew. And then he'd returned to England, to his homeland and the land he intended to change for the better. Hadrian hadn't recognized him the day they had officially met. That was the key thing looking back. No one treated him as though he was unimportant, but Hadrian had. Boldly and with confidence that could only be inspired by a great deal of power and knowledge, Hadrian Black had all but scorned him and his advances. Annoyed and intrigued, he'd set Severus on the man, intending to spy on him. The only problem was that Hadrian had rid Severus of what the Dark Lord was holding over his head. He had nothing to hold over the young man, and Severus had always been the type that would defend until the death. Threatening his life would have been pointless, since the young man obviously held Hadrian in high esteem. He had underestimated Hadrian Black. He smirked slightly as he made his way through the flow. Hadrian hated when people underestimated him. He paused in memory of their wedding night. He'd planned on making the man his. Power like that was simply too great to be left alone. He couldn't risk the man turning on him, and he had tired of the subtle hints of what the boy could offer. He had been willing to break one of his greatest rules, to allow the man to stand beside him rather than under him like the other Death Eaters. He hadn't anticipated what he'd seen that night. The grace, agility and power. Hadrian had tossed some of his greatest men to the side as though they were toys he was too old for. He was a general, and the Dark Lord could see that clearly. As the man fought, he was assessing. The Dark Lord had no doubt that within the first 10 minutes of the duel, Hadrian could have placed any one of his men into the order that would have given them the highest chance of winning. The sight of the lithe, experienced body flashing through the air, dancing and green eyes glowing with dark energy as magic rose and soaked the room around him, Hadrian had been breathtaking. He'd known almost immediately that what he had previously found as attractive in the man could become very, very dangerous to him. He had never loved another before. He had never wanted to love another before, well, not since he was a pathetic weakling of a child. But Hadrian challenged him, infuriated him, and offered him what he doubted that he would ever find in another person. That look, that submission, he had to have it. It had to be his, as if there was a part of him that thrived on it. Others gave him willingly what Hadrian Black would never give another soul. Except him, and only because he'd taken it by force. But he would win the man over. He'd won Hadrian's heart, but only just and by no fault of his own, winning his trust, winning the absolute surety that the man belonged only to him. That would take time. But he had time. He had all of eternity now. His hand reached into his pocket where the Philosopher's Stone rested. Hadrian would be his in every way. "My lord, are you quite all right?" he snapped out of his thoughts, startled by Abraxas' presence. He frowned, realizing that he was clutching his chest, a dull ache pulsing under his hand. Had he eaten something odd? "Quite well, Abraxas. Now I believe you have a report for me," he said silkily. Abraxas frowned but nodded and handed him a file all the same. "What are you doing?" the Dark Lord asked with a frown as Harry promptly sat on the ground beside the throne and spread rolls of parchment around, pulling a bottle of red ink from his pocket and a quill from his hair. "You kidnapped me," Harry said shortly. "I have a meeting," the Dark Lord said curiously. "I have papers to grade," Harry returned with a quirked eyebrow. "And if I want you to be a part of this meeting?" the Dark Lord asked dryly. "I'm listening," Harry said with a smirk. "Besides, these papers are ridiculous here. Look at how Theodore spelled the word right," he pointed out. The Dark Lord snorted and Harry returned it to the ground, circling it with red ink. "As much as I like you on your knees, I much rather prefer my consort to have some dignity," the Dark Lord said, snapping his fingers. A writing desk appeared beside him and Harry rose an eyebrow at how much like the desks at Hogwarts it looked. "I'm sensing a message through this," he said, amused. "Of course you do, my naughty little Slytherin. Now begin writing your lines, or I'm afraid I'll have to make use of my paddle," the man said, amused. Harry shivered slightly as he remembered the last time the Dark Lord had played this game. It was a good thing no one had arrived yet. It was bad enough that Harry had been forced to transfigure his slippers and robe into something more suitable for the surprise kidnapping the Dark Lord had done, but now the man was being kinky, and he knew how much Harry loved it when he was being kinky. He made a show of rolling his eyes. "Fine, Professor," he drawled lazily, causing the man's eyes to flash. "Excuse me," the man said, warning in his voice. "I said fine," Harry stressed. "Geez, get off my back, will ya?" he said, shuffling to his seat. Not like I could help myself. I mean, Malfoy's was right in my face." "He was asking for a grope," Harry said, crossing his arms as he sat down. Red eyes darkened and flashed. "You just ruined a perfectly good fantasy, Hadrian," the man said with a sneer. Harry smirked. The Dark Lord hated when he used Lucius in their games. Harry spread his paperwork around him smugly. "What you deserve for dragging me out of my bed at 2 in the morning," Harry said, shifting slightly as he tried to calm himself. "Besides, I don't know if you've noticed, but we have company," Harry said, circling a word in the essay he was reading. The Dark Lord frowned and looked up. Abraxas stood to the side, twitching slightly, though you could hardly tell with his robes covering him so completely. "My lord," the man greeted tightly. "Beeper," Harry said smugly. "You will pay for this later," the Dark Lord said dryly. "Yes, Professor," Harry said, smirking as he did his marking. "Did you take your potions?" the man said suspiciously. Harry frowned. "I'm fine," he said lazily. Fingers slipped into his hair and his breath caught in his throat when his head was yanked back and cold red eyes stared down at him. "Consort," the man said stiffly. "Take your potions now," the man ordered. Harry shivered and reached into his pocket, pulling out the vials, taking them one by one. The hand in his hair remained until the last of the vials was taken. Slowly his hair was released, elegant fingers toying with it briefly to bring it back into a neat cascade. "Better," the man said silkily. Harry merely nodded and returned to his marking. There was something odd about this, he knew it. Had anyone else done that to him, they would have lost an arm, if not their life. But this was different, like something stopped him, like he almost wanted the man to act the way he had. He shook his head idly and continued working in silence, calmed by the fingers that combed through his hair in gentle tugs. "Avery, what news do you have?" the Dark Lord said, turning to the meeting. "I have the maps you requested, my lord," the man said, approaching them. Harry glanced up and caught the man's sneer before he could cover it. "Crucio," Harry said lazily, not even bothering to pull out his wand. Red eyes flickered up from where he was reading the file and watched Avery scream with a flare of heat. Harry waited until the man was fallen to the floor, body contorting in every which direction, blood pouring from his nose. He released the spell carefully. "Excuse me, Avery, but did you just sneer at me?" Harry said coldly. Dark eyes flashed up at him, and for Harry felt his control shiver under the weight of his temper. He didn't move from where he was sitting, but his eyes narrowed dangerously. Suddenly the man was being lifted, his gaze sneering. "Legilimens." Harry was unaware in his anger that he'd hissed the word in Parstletongue. He dove into the man's mind, relentlessly tearing roughly at the pathetic walls the man had built around his mind. The man saw him as nothing more than a whore, something that the Dark Lord would throw away at any given moment. Harry pulled out and let the man fall to the ground in a sobbing heap, blood pouring from his nose and ears as he gasped. "You speak Parstletongue," the Dark Lord whispered, his eyes wide. Harry realized belatedly what he'd done, but there was no going back. Besides, he was still shaken from what he'd seen in the man's mind. Was that what he'd become? AF **** toy. He turned his gaze to Red Eyes. "Am I yours? Am I truly yours? Or am I a toy to pass the time?" he said softly. Red Eyes sharpened and flared. Harry shook his head. "They think that I'm a whore, your toy to pass the time. Tell me, my lord, is that truly what I am?" His worst fears coming to light in the scorn of another man's eyes, Harry couldn't stop his hands from trembling. It was happening again. He would be left, abandoned, made the joke of society. "You are mine, Haudrain, my consort, my second in command. No one else can stand where you stand. Anyone who dares try will find themselves at my mercy," the Dark Lord said in English. Harry was so startled by it. The man was claiming him aloud, staring him down with an intense gaze. "I ask you to do things at times, Hadrian. I ask you to dress up and play parts, or to accept my little say-ual quirks, but that does not make you anything less than my consort," the man said fiercely. Harry felt himself sway slightly. He wasn't being left, wasn't being insulted. His hand reached for his other hand where the ring sat. "I will not betray you," the Dark Lord swore, eyeing the motion Harry made. Harry shivered and nodded before crossing the distance between them. "My lord," Harry said softly. He couldn't continue, his mind was a whir, and he knew that if he let go he might not come back. "Kill him," the Dark Lord said with narrowed eyes. "Let it be known that anyone who shows scorn to my consort will receive a death sentence," the Dark Lord said, reaching out and grasping Harry's hand. For a second no one moved, and Avery stared up at them with wide eyes. "Yes, my lord," Abraxas said, breaking the still of the moment before striding forward. Take your time, old friend. Make a point of it. The Dark Lord said, lifting Harry's hand and pressing a key to his knuckles. You can't be in agreement with this. Harry scowled as he looked up at the headmaster. He was brewing a very delicate mixture, and it was bad enough that James and Sirius had gotten into trouble and were under his supervision for detention, distracting him from his work. Severus glanced up from his own station and Harry saw him pull out his wand subtly. And pray tell, headmaster, what is it exactly that I'm in agreement with? He asked, quirking his eyebrow at the man. His patience was thin after having to deal with Minerva for over a half an hour. The woman had it out for Sirius lately. The headmaster, without his usual calm demeanor, strode through his classroom and slammed a file onto his workstation. Harry glanced at it casually. The word is that Avery here offended the Dark Lord's consort. This is what is left of him. Dumbledore said through his teeth. Harry glanced at the images curiously. He shouldn't have pissed off the Dark Lord's consort, Harry said with a shrug as he expertly sliced thin slices of the root he was preparing and carefully began to set them into the murky brown potion, causing it to turn bright yellow. He had a son, the headmaster said, who from what I hear is probably very glad that his father and his father's wandering hands are gone. Harry said, stirring carelessly. Is this what this is about? Jealousy, the headmaster said darkly. Harry frowned and glanced up. You really do think the worst of him, always and without caution. Tell me, headmaster, have you ever heard the idea that when you expect something out of a person, what you are expecting will most likely be what you get? He narrowed his eyes. You see, headmaster, what I find as funny is that you came all the way down to my labs to defend a pedophile and to condemn the Dark Lord for apparently defending his consort's honor when really I have very little to do with the matter. Tell me, headmaster, your statement when you came down here, was it really for me? He drawled, leaning back. Or was it for you? He said coolly. You cannot be in agreement with this, he repeated. But you can, can't you? And that is what bothers you the most, he said, flicking his wand at the potion and casting the last enchantment, causing it to turn green. Checkmate, Harry said softly as he watched the headmaster's face turn red, then white, and at last gray. We've lost you then, Hadrian, the man said softly. Harry poured the potion into the vials and quirked an eyebrow. I was unaware that I had gone anywhere. By the way, I noticed your rheumatism has been acting up, he said, handing the man one of the vials of potion. I've just found a way to reverse it, he said dryly before carefully placing the remaining vials into the metal tray. You certainly have a way of thanking me for saving you from another night of endless pain, he said with a sneer. Potter, clean out this cauldron and you can go. Make sure you use the gloves, he said sharply. Hadrian, the headmaster said softly but firmly. I think I'll sell this one, Harry murmured, holding up the vial. A bit expensive to make, but well worth the price. Besides, if my theory is correct, then taking this consistently for 5 weeks should permanently rid the body of any signs of rheumatism. The door opened and Harry snorted as the Dark Lord strode through with a bouquet of white roses. Has my office become a common room? He wondered aloud before flicking his wand at the roses and causing them to burn up. Let me guess, dinner at the Malfoys, he said, crossing his arms. Who else would have the gall to make me bring you flowers? The Dark Lord said, amused. Headmaster, he greeted. Harry held up a vial of potion. Look, I've just created the cure for rheumatism, he said, smirking. Clever, UG. Headmaster, really? Those pictures in front of the students? The Dark Lord said, feigning disdain as he flipped the folder shut. Tom, I was willing to work beside you for Hadrian's sake, but there are some things that I cannot and will not tolerate. Like neglect, leaving a child in the hands of their abuser. This seems to be a growing trend with you, headmaster, the Dark Lord said with a small smile. Or perhaps in sending your so-called friends to their death, the Dark Lord purred. So I was right. Hadrian stiffened as he turned to James and Sirius. He'd all but forgotten that they were there. James looked ill, his eyes wide and hurt. Harry felt his breath catch as a chill raced down his spine. But how could this be? He hadn't done anything to change fate. A dull ache began to grow in his chest. You were the one that sent my mum and dad to the vampires, James whispered. Harry felt a ripple of something wash through him and agony suddenly blossomed from his chest. Arg! Harry clutched his chest as the world spun around him. Hadrian, the Dark Lord said, lurching forward and catching him. Hurts, Harry managed with a whimper. Merlin, it felt as though something was forcing its way out of his stomach and chest at the same time. Temporal shift, the headmaster hissed. Harry looked down and stared at his torso, whimpering as it blurred in and out of existence. Hadrian, Hadrian, stay with me, the Dark Lord said, his face turning pale. Harry whimpered as the man grasped his hand and squeezed tightly, the marks on their wrists burning. He's bleeding, Severus said, suddenly panicked. Harry felt something warm trickle down his forehead and groaned softly. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Come, child of time, come to me. Harry let out a shout as something around him suddenly shifted. Hadrian, he's gone. I'm here, child. Harry stared in silent shock at the woman. Gone was his beloved, gone the children that he'd grown to know. He looked down and stared at his body. It was blurred as though he'd lost his glasses, but that was insane. He hadn't needed his glasses for years. He looked back at the woman and found that she was very much just as blurred as he was. What are you? He whispered. He couldn't make out any features beyond the shape of a woman. A sound like white noise pulsated around him and he felt as though his feet couldn't find solid ground to stand on. I am time. Harry wondered if perhaps he'd gone mad. Excuse me, he said weakly as he struggled to stay standing. I am time. The woman repeated, the feminine voice fading and echoing and whirling. Harry felt a sick lurch in his stomach. And now you are too. Harry swallowed thickly. What? You have played too often and too wrongly with time, now you must become time. Harry stared hard at the woman's blurred frame and a sense of wrongness overcame him. Why are you a blur? Harry's eyes grew wide. Why was he speaking like she was? Like an echo that didn't quite sync up properly. He couldn't see her fully, but he didn't have to know that she was smiling cruelly. He felt suddenly very old and then in the same instant very childlike. You are now a child of time. Welcome. And then he felt another vicious tug and he was soaring through the air, or at least he thought it was the air. Harry arrived in a burst of light and let out a key as a green curse exploded against him, sending him soaring and hitting a wall. Mother F*******. He hissed in pain and shock. Hadrian. Harry growled as he looked up, his eyes widening at what he saw. Lily, the woman from his memory, pale as a sheet as she clutched a child to her chest. A child with black hair, a child that he knew immediately wasn't him, a child that wasn't James Potter's son. He turned slowly to the other figure in the room and caught red eyes. Hadrian, the Dark Lord whispered. Harry stared at the man in shock. Gone was the soft look in the man's eyes, gone was the gentle grace, the little things he'd come to know. This man was hard, brittle and mad. You can't hurt her, you swore you wouldn't. I have an oath. Harry said, forcing himself to stand though his body ached terribly. His mind whirled with possibilities and a terrible, frightening truth. You were just hit by an Avada Kedavra. The Dark Lord muttered. My Adavra Kedavra, he said blankly. How long have I been gone? Harry asked, clutching his chest as he came to terms with the fact that there was no way Lily could have graduated, gotten pregnant and had her child in the span of a few days or even weeks. 2 years. The Dark Lord breathed. I thought you were gone forever. He added, his voice catching. Do you even know what you've done to me? He rasped, his eyes wide and hurt. Hadrian, please, he's going to kill my baby. Lily said, sobbing suddenly. Harry stared at her in shock. The prophesy. He breathed. You know. The Dark Lord demanded, his eyes burning suddenly and fiercely. Obsessed. The man was obsessed and it was happening all over again. It's false, you twat, Harry roared. A self-fulfilling prophecy. Harry was marked as the Dark Lord's equal, made into a paradox, and obviously his disappearance had done more to the man than he'd thought. The Dark Lord strode towards him, wand drawn and eyes wild. Harry wondered if the man wouldn't kill him. Instead, the man's fingers wound into his hair and he found himself being keyed as though the man wanted to beep out his soul. I waited. The man murmured, still keying him deeply. Every day I waited for you, he said against Harry's lips. Every hour I waited. Every moment I looked for you. You are my madness, Hadrian. You are burned into my very soul, etched into my being. These bands bind our souls together. The man roared, lifting his free arm to show the band around his wrist. Without you, and then the man was shivering and pulling him to his chest, holding him tightly. So empty. The man breathed, inhaling his scent and shaking as he clutched Harry to him. "Take me home," Harry whispered, wrapping his arms around the man. "I'm yours," he swore quietly. "No," the man said, suddenly pulling back. "I must find a way of anchoring you here. I won't let you disappear again. I can't, I won't," Harry gasped as they were suddenly apparated before landing in the man's study. "Albus has ideas, but they need to be refined, Albus." The Dark Lord was rushing about the study, hands flickering this way and that as books and scrolls flew around him in a flurry. "Elf, get Albus," the Dark Lord stormed, already buried 3 feet deep in books and scrolls. Red eyes flickered up and towards him, showing a desperation that Harry didn't know he could have ever believed in the man. "Stay within my sight always, my love," the man whispered, his tongue flickering across his dry lips. "Please," he begged. Harry felt his eyes widen and his heart sing in his chest. "Love, love, love," he fell back and into a couch, a stupid grin spreading across his lips before he could stop it. "Hadrian." Harry turned and stared in shock at the headmaster. 2 years and the headmaster's tawny beard and hair had turned snow white. The man's expression was grim, his eyes darkened. "What?" Harry breathed, still too stunned to do much of anything. "The Dark Lord took the world by storm after you disappeared, Hadrian. He now rules Wizarding Britain," the man said softly. "A madman rules us," he added. "Albus, shut up and help me over here," Voldemort demanded. "He agreed to let me stay on as headmaster of Hogwarts only if I helped him look for a way to save you," the headmaster said softly before crossing the room and speaking softly with the Dark Lord. Harry stared at the two of them in stunned silence. It felt as though it had only been a few moments. He'd talked to time, a single conversation that had apparently taken 2 years. And apparently a lot had changed. "Where is he? I'll kill him." Harry was startled by the familiar voice. It wasn't the voice that he'd grown used to hearing, but rather a voice that he remembered distantly, the voice of a man. A man that he'd once known as Severus Snape. Sure enough, the doors crashed open and Severus stormed through, power crackling around him like a storm. "You tried to kill my son. My Lily." Severus growled, his wand trained on the Dark Lord. Harry stared at him in shock. This Severus was nothing like he remembered him being. He was tall, yes, thin, yes, and pale, yes, but his face was filled with life and light and now rage. His hair was down to the middle of his back and his robes cut richly. "Wait, son." The pieces began to fall into place and Harry felt himself twitch. "My lord," Harry said softly, dangerously. All eyes turned to him and Severus gasped. "There was a prophecy," the Dark Lord said, shifting slightly. "Hadrain," Severus breathed. Harry stood from the couch and sent the Dark Lord a vicious glare. "My lord, I love you, but children are off limits," Harry said coldly. "I will leave you if you try to harm another child," he said as calmly as he could. The Dark Lord stared at him in horror. "You can't," the man breathed. It was only then that Harry realized how broken the Dark Lord was, how maddened by his absence the man had become. Why, this man was nearly like the Voldemort of his time. Harry winced as a sharp pain tore through his mind and he gasped, clutching his head. The Voldemort of his time, what did that mean? Harry felt the color leave his face. He couldn't remember. What? There was something very vital, something that he should remember, a great many things he should remember, but he couldn't. Hadrian. He realized belatedly that he was being held. The Dark Lord was holding him, cradling him, red eyes concerned as they raked over him, searching for injury. "I can't remember," Harry said with a frown. "My life, I came from a different time, but I can't remember. Who was I?" he said, tears coursing down his cheeks. "Gone, all of it gone," he breathed. "Hush, hush now, my pet, it doesn't matter. You have me and I have you. I will keep you safe." Harry felt terror slip through him. Who was he? Voldemort held Hadrian in his arms. His consort had wept himself to sleep, but for what loss neither of them knew. Hadrian had never spoken of anything good from his previous time, only of war and death and decay. So why was he so upset? The Dark Lord had no idea, but he'd be damned if he left his consort to suffer alone. He shivered slightly and held Hadrian closer. Hadrian. When Hadrian had disappeared, he'd thought that the man would be back in moments, perhaps hours. He'd sent his condolences to missing Lucius' engagement party and waited in the dungeons for his lover, intending to give him the paddling of a lifetime for the inconvenience. But Hadrian hadn't returned. For 3 days he sat in that room staring at the spot Hadrian had disappeared from and not moving. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep, and as the days continued, a horrible thought crossed his mind. Hadrian wasn't coming back. He could feel him, faintly through their link. When he traced his fingers over the tattoo of roses, he could swear that he could feel Hadrian. But then one day the tattoo faded, blurred right before his eyes. He'd stared at it in dawning horror. No, no. Fate couldn't be so cruel. No. That was the last clear thought he had. He remembered finding Albus. He remembered demanding that Hadrian be returned to him. But the old man had little to offer him. He'd left the man's office feeling strangely hollow and broken, as though he'd never feel the same again, as though everything good in him had been torn away. A sea of blood followed after. During the times that he was lucid, he would wake to find himself staring at his empty wrist, weeping openly the way he had not since he was a child. It took 2 months of this madness to convince him of a very real fact. He was in love with Hadrian. And he couldn't live without him. Hadrian was the balance in his life. Hadrian made things make sense, curbed the violence in his nature, and made him aware of himself. Without Hadrian he was nothing. A Dark Lord, he took over Wizarding Britain, but when he turned around there was no Hadrian to show for it. There was no honor, no glory, and no point. He lost himself to the madness. Say it again. His breath caught in his throat at Hadrian's sleepy murmur. Green eyes cracked open and he stared down at them, wondering if he'd ever seen anything more beautiful. What you said earlier, say it again. Hadrian asked, his eyes dropping hesitantly. Voldemort frowned, not quite understanding what was being asked of him. I love you. Hadrian offered, a slight blush on his cheeks. He was still as he'd been when he'd left, hesitant, afraid to admit that he loved him. But it was enough, and Voldemort understood. I love you, Hadrian, he said softly. And he did. He could do nothing but love Hadrian. The man had broken him. He would quite literally do anything for him. Voldemort wondered if the man even knew the power he now had. He might be the one in charge in their relationship, but Hadrian could get him to do anything he wanted. The Dark Lord shivered as a chill raced down his spine. But he wasn't the same man Hadrian had once loved. He wondered if Hadrian even knew what he'd become. He closed his eyes as the madness crept in on him. No, he had Hadrian. He pulled the man closer and pressed their foreheads together. Immediately he felt better, until Hadrian let out a pained hiss and something warm trickled down his brow. Red eyes snapped open and stared in stunned silence at the blood slipping down Hadrian's forehead. Hadrian stared at him blankly for a moment. What have you done? He breathed. What have you done? He wept. Voldemort could only wonder the same thing. Hadrian stared down at Wizarding Britain, arms crossed behind him. Time was wearing on him. He couldn't remember anything, and none of what he did remember made sense anymore. It had been 3 years since he'd returned. 3 long years. He turned slightly to stare at the Dark Lord, to watch the stranger in his beloved's body work silently and feverishly. Every so often the man would let out a vicious twitch or his eyes would glaze over. He wouldn't tell Harry what he'd done, and as mad as he was, Harry knew that the man might not even know what he'd done to himself. What he'd had with the Dark Lord, it was gone for the most part. The man was fragile, his fire gone as though it had been taken from him the day Hadrian had disappeared. In a way he supposed that this was a good thing. It had allowed him to make some changes of his own in the world to protect it from the fiery violence in the man's madness. Somehow only Harry had the power to stay the man's hand. But he didn't have to like it, not when he could still taste what they'd had on the tip of his tongue. Excuse me. Harry turned curiously to the little girl who was staring up at him with a determined expression on her face. Bushy hair, 2 large teeth, and a child to boot. A very small child with very big attitude. He felt himself smile despite himself. May I help you? He asked, sending the Death Eaters an enquiring gaze. The man shook their heads and shrugged, not entirely willing to touch the child at all, knowing how protective that he and the Dark Lord were over children in general. I was sent this letter before I was born, the girl said with an important lift of her chin as she held out a letter and a small pouch. My mother thought it was a hoax, you know, but I knew that it couldn't be, so I brought it here just like you said I should," she said with a nod. Harry frowned and stepped closer to her, eyeing the letter and the small pouch cautiously before frowning at the sight of his own writing. He accepted the letter and read through it carefully before freezing. "His memories," he gasped. The Dark Lord, who had been watching with apparent interest, set down his quill and stood from where he'd been working. "My love," the man said curiously. Harry didn't look up though. Without a thought he was pulling the vials from the pouch and opening them. The wisps of memories rushed through his nose in blue smoke, and suddenly he could remember. His eyes widened and his face paled. Swallowing, he pulled the cork off the second vial and inhaled. Then the third, the fourth, and so on. Harry felt tears drip down his cheeks and blood from his nose. Of course, how could he have forgotten? Hermione, Ron. He shivered when arms settled around him. Battle, war, blood. So much blood painting his hands, his skin. "Hadrian, my love," the Dark Lord whispered. Harry stared down at the little girl and felt a small smile appear on his lips as he reached up and wiped the blood away. He had been terrified of losing what he'd had. The first time it had been mentioned that losing them could be a side effect of the temporal shifts, he made copies of his memories and sent them to the one person he knew that he could trust to keep them safe for him no matter what time or place. The only person who would have remained constant no matter what, Hermione Granger. He said softly, "Thank you, child. I don't think you know the true extent of what you've done for me," he whispered, tears dripping down his cheeks. The little girl scuffed her shoes shyly, her cheeks pink. "I just did what needed to be done, sir," she piped up. "Hadrian," the Dark Lord said, petting his hair lightly. His hands were trembling. It pained him to know that they had once been so steady. This was not his beloved. "I remember everything, my love," Harry said, turning to his Dark Lord. Red eyes widened and softened. "I take it that this is a good thing then," he said, waving the Death Eaters off. His head jerked and twitched, his hands flexing. "Make certain this child is rewarded greatly," he told them as they guided the small child out of the room. "Yes, but," he swallowed as he looked at the man. This man was a broken shard of his lover. He needed his lord back. "I don't know what you've done, my love, but please, whatever it is that you've done to yourself," he bit his lip, his eyes wide and sad. "I remember what you were like, in my time, and it isn't so different from this. I want the Riddle I knew back. I want Lord Gaunt back," he pleaded with tears in his eyes. The Dark Lord's eyes widened and Harry pressed his lips together into a thin line. He had an idea, a vague, incomplete idea of what had happened. A suspicion more than anything. "I lost the Philosopher's Stone," the Dark Lord breathed. Harry felt his breath catch. "Then I will make you a new one," he swore. "Make it and I will do as you ask," the man said, his eyes torn. Harry nodded. He could understand. The Dark Lord's greatest fear was that they would be parted again, which should have been impossible to begin with. Harry turned his gaze towards the wizarding world. Hermione had been right. There was no second war, there wasn't going to be one. He wouldn't allow it. "Hadrian, you cannot ask this of me," the headmaster said furiously. But Harry would not be deterred. Every moment with this wraith-like Voldemort grated on him. It was wrong, incomplete, and he had to fix it, thus the sudden warrant to search the aged headmaster's home. "There's something wrong with him," Harry said softly as the Death Eaters carelessly tossed fragile instruments around. "You let him do it to himself, I know you did, you might even have been the one to guide him to it." Dumbledore's suddenly thin pale lips were all the answer he needed. "Why?" Harry demanded. There was only person on this earth that he knew of who would be able to do this to his lord. "I thought he would destroy himself through it," the headmaster admitted, his tone clipped a hard, grim smile on his lips. "I even created the first one for him," he said, lifting up his hand. Harry's breath caught in his throat. He had been drawn here first of all. He could feel it, a tug in his head. The Gaunt ring, Voldemort had never been without it. Until Harry had gone missing. "Give it to me or I will cut off your hand," Harry demanded, his heart pounding in his chest. Close, so close as though the bond was crying out to him. "Would you really?" the headmaster challenged. Harry let out a hiss, and before the man could speak again, Harry's blade was cutting through skin and bone and sinew, slicing the man's hand clean from his wrist. Anything for the man he loved. Ed with my beloved. You risked the very fate of this world. He growled, yanking the ring free of the twitching hand before casting a spell on the hand and watching with satisfaction as it burned. I trusted you once, headmaster, but never again. He swore, slipping the ring onto his own finger, feeling a rush of power and familiarity. What have you done to him? He demanded. Blue eyes burned fiercely, and Harry knew without a doubt that the man wouldn't tell him. I'll never say, the man said predictably. Harry narrowed his eyes. Funny thing, headmaster. You see, when potions are created, they have a bit of the potions master's magic inside of them. Over time, if enough potions from the same potions master is ingested, he watched the man's eyes widen. My magic is a part of you, you cannot escape me. He said softly. Legilimens, he hissed. Harry sighed as he watched the change occur. Voldemort's eyes darkened, became sharper and richer. His body went from being unstable to stable, confident and sure. Hands that had shaken for the last few years steadied and relaxed. The man's beauty was untouched, of course, but that had never been the point. Red eyes pierced him. Hadrian, the Dark Lord said calmly, velvet heat in his words. Harry felt himself drop to his knees in relief and grasped the man's hand. My lord, he breathed. A hand wound into his hair and he was bodily forced to his feet the way he hadn't been in so very long. Pet, the man said, smirking slightly. Quite, Harry agreed before his mouth was claimed. You kneel willingly. The Dark Lord purred against his lips. Harry shivered and wound his arms around the man's neck. Yes, he breathed. Mine, the Dark Lord said before dragging him into the key. Yours, Harry thought as his mouth was devoured. And he was. The Dark Lord's consort. Blue eyes watched them blankly and an old tired face relaxed. It had taken a great deal from him, winning this war. Of course Harry would never know, he couldn't know. The boy he had once seen like a son was no more, and he'd caused that change. The ultimate outcome: people still died, but not nearly as many people as could have died. He was satisfied with the way things turned out. Hadrian Black was more suited for the Dark Lord than he would ever know. Albus watched with a small smile as his fingers blurred and shifted. It is time, Albus Dumbledore. The voice carried softly. He watched in fascination as the tips of his fingers began to fall away like dust. It was fine though, he'd done what he'd come to do. His hand was gone now and slowly his wrist was dissolving. A small smile flitted across his lips. This was a much better outcome. Even if no one ever understood that he'd done it. He turned slowly and felt the wind rustle through him, a slight chill surrounding him as he shifted, and silence surrounded him, and he slowly became one with the sands of time. A million shifts of time and light and color later, and before Hermione sat at the old headmaster's desk staring at the tome she'd just been handed in complete shock. I didn't want to give this to you, Miss Granger. The headmistress said, her eyes aged and weary. Hermione ran her hands through her short hair in distress. But you've seen it too, I'd wager. She said with a nod. The boy we once knew as Harry Potter is gone. I'm afraid we have no choice. The woman said firmly. Hermione smiled bitterly as she stared down at the diagram. Da Vinci, she said softly. He used Da Vinci, she breathed. Albus took the Vitruvian man and made him something completely different. Minerva said lightly. If only she knew, planting that portrait in time, knowing that the brilliance of the man called Da Vinci would call to his younger self. Oh, how he'd idolized the genius, ironic looking back on it. After all, he was Da Vinci. A paradox, Hermione said with a slightly hysterical laugh. That should be impossible, she said, shaking her head. A time paradox, the headmistress smiled wryly. Since when has anything impossible ever stopped Mr. Potter? She asked, her lips twitching. Hermione stared down at the drawings and diagrams and shook her head. Never, she said softly. We could save the world with this. The headmistress said softly. And destroy my only remaining friend. Hermione said, a choked sob leaving her before she could stop it. She slapped her hand over her mouth and wept silently. Albus has always had something up his sleeve, Miss Granger, trust him in this. She said softly. Hermione nodded slowly. Trust the man that abandoned us in our hour of need. She said wryly. The headmistress frowned and turned away. Trust the man who gave his life for this war. Perhaps, there is more to Albus' disappearance than meets the eye. She said, challenging her. Hermione stared down at the images, the formulas, impossible codes. Yet she knew with the same surety that there was only one person that could make this work. Harry Potter, the boy who lived. She nodded softly. Fine, she said slowly, her fingers tracing the indents of the ink in the parchment. But I'll give him his best shot. I won't just leave him stranded somewhere without anyone to rely on. I have to do some research. She said, her mind already working a million equations and probabilities through. Minerva felt a chill waft over the back of her neck and shivered slightly as desperate, war-hardened brown eyes turned to her. Gone was the bright-eyed child that had so proudly flounced into Hogwarts, boasting about having read Hogwarts a history. Minerva resisted the urge to sigh. So many of her students had lost that spark. I'll do it, Hermione said with a sharp nod. Albus smiled from where his body shifted and blurred and began to fall away as the circle was completed and his life was extinguished. I'll save him yet, Hermione said, turning her gaze to the reddened sunset. And so it began. The tale of the Vitruvian Man. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.